You're standing in this ancient church, the stone floor cool beneath your feet, the lofty arches disappearing into shadow high above. The air is thick with history, quiet except for the distant sounds of the modern world filtering through thick walls. Your eyes drift towards the choir, that section usually set apart near the altar, lined with rows of wooden seats. These aren't just simple benches. They're often elaborate structures, carved from dark, aged wood, each seat potentially a small masterpiece of medieval craftsmanship. This is where the regular occupants of the church, the clergy, the monks, or in our case tonight, the nuns, would sit for long hours of prayer, chanting, and contemplation during their daily services, the divine office. You picture the scene, figures in habits, heads bowed, voices raised in plain song, the rhythmic flow of liturgical time marking the days, weeks, and years. It all seems incredibly solemn, incredibly holy. But the medieval world, as you'll find, was rarely as one-dimensionally pious as we sometimes imagine, from a distance of centuries. It was a world of stark contrasts, of deep faith intertwined with earthy realities, of rigorous spiritual discipline existing alongside unexpected expressions of human nature. And it's in these choir stalls, specifically on the underside of the seats, that some of the most perplexing and, yes, sometimes scandalous examples of this medieval complexity are found. You might trace the intricate patterns with your finger, delicate foliage perhaps, or geometric designs. Then you might lift one of the hinged seats, revealing the hidden surface beneath. And there, nestled out of sight when the seat is down, you encounter it, a carving that makes you pause. It might be grotesque, a contorted face or a strange beast. Or, and this is where our story takes its most intriguing turn, it might be explicitly erotic. Yes, images you'd expect to find maybe in a dusty medical text from the era, or perhaps illustrating some bawdy folktale, certainly not tucked away in the solemn heart of a place dedicated to God. You might see figures engaged in sexual acts or carvings of genitalia or scenes that depict human anatomy in ways that feel decidedly not like something from a prayer book. The sheer incongruity hits you. Why here? Why hidden? And considering the rigorous, often ascetic lives lived within these walls, particularly by nuns who had sworn vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty, the presence of such imagery feels not just out of place, but almost impossibly dissonant. Historians still argue whether the most provocative carvings were made by clergy, hired lay craftsmen, or indeed the residents themselves, be they monks or nuns. But the focus tonight is on the specific instances found in convents, where female hands might have held the carving tools. Imagine a nun, perhaps in her quiet moments, working on a piece of wood that would be part of her daily environment for years, maybe decades. What thoughts were running through her mind as she shaped wood into forms that seemed so contrary to her spiritual calling? Was it a private joke, a coded message, an act of rebellion, or something else entirely? This is the central mystery we'll gently explore. It challenges our often sanitized view of medieval religious life and forces us to confront the full, messy, often contradictory spectrum of human experience, even behind cloistered walls. The churches where these carvings are found aren't necessarily grand cathedrals, though some might be associated with larger monastic complexes. Often they are the chapels of smaller convents, tucked away in towns or the countryside. The carvings might not be immediately obvious. You have to look for them, lift the seats, peer into shadowed corners. They are, in a sense, secrets whispered in wood, preserved across centuries, waiting for a curious eye to uncover them. And tonight, that curious eye is yours. You are the quiet observer, stepping back in time to ponder these silent, enigmatic clues left behind by people whose lives were outwardly dedicated to the divine, but whose inner worlds, perhaps, contain multitudes, expressed in ways we are still trying to understand. Get ready to explore the physical space in the hidden art within. Let's talk a little more about the seats themselves because they aren't just simple chairs. These are choir stalls, and the hinged seat you lift has a technical name, specifically the part you're looking at, the misericord. The word literally translates from Latin as mercy seat, and you might think, mercy? For whom? And for what? Well, for the long hours spent standing during the divine office. Monastic life, for both monks and nuns, revolved around a demanding schedule of prayer services held at set times throughout the day and night, the Opus Dei, or work of God. This could mean standing for hours on end, especially during solemn services like Matins, which might begin deep in the night, to offer a bit of, well, mercy. During these lengthy periods of standing, the underside of the hinged seat was often fitted with a small projecting ledge or bracket. When the seat was flipped up, you could lean against this small shelf, taking some weight off your feet while still appearing to be standing. It was a discreet way to find a bit of relief without fully sitting down, which wasn't allowed during certain parts of the service. Imagine standing for 2 hours at 2 a.m. in a cold stone building. A little ledge to lean on? Yeah, you'd probably carve anything you wanted under there just out of gratitude. This practical function is a mainstream historical fact about choir stalls and monastic life. They weren't just decorative furniture. They were tools of endurance for a physically demanding spiritual practice. Now, the surfaces of these misericords, the part facing downwards and usually hidden from casual view, became a canvas. While some feature simple, abstract designs or religious motifs, many others display an astonishing array of secular, satirical, moralistic, and yes, sometimes surprisingly crude imagery. You might find carvings of animals behaving like humans, scenes from fables, depictions of everyday medieval life, like a baker getting punished for selling light loaves, or a hunter in his basa, mythical creatures, or grotesque figures with contorted faces and bodies. It's a whole hidden world of medieval thought and imagination carved in wood. And among these, in various churches and former monastic houses across Europe, you find the ones that make you do a double take. The erotic carvings. They aren't universally present in every set of choir stalls, not even in every set with misericords, but they appear often enough to be a recognized, if perplexing, category. Think about it. Here are individuals who have sworn their lives to God, committed to celibacy, spending their days in prayer and contemplation, carving or commissioning images that seem to celebrate or at least acknowledge the very desires and activities they are meant to transcend. One quirky or fringe tidbit you might stumble upon while researching these carvings is the sheer inventiveness of the medieval mind when it came to the grotesque. Forget your standard gargoyles. You might find carvings of people pulling faces to show their backside, or figures intertwined with monstrous beasts in ways that defy easy interpretation, blending human form with animalistic or demonic features. It's a visual language that's both disturbing and fascinating, and the erotic carvings sometimes share this boundary-pushing quality, merging desire with the monstrous or the absurd. Like, what is that thing with the human legs and the... Nope, let's not dwell there too long. It's almost bedtime. The point is, the erotic isn't always presented straightforwardly. It can be woven into this broader tapestry of the bizarre and the satirical. So you have these tiny, hidden sculptures, sometimes just a few inches across, tucked away on the underside of seats used daily by nuns for hours. The wood itself would have been worked with hand tools, carefully shaped, probably initially by skilled carpenters, but potentially finished or added to by the occupants themselves, especially if the convent had resources or a tradition of crafts. Medieval nunneries weren't just places of prayer, they were often significant economic entities, involved in various trades, farming, writing, and artistic pursuits. It's entirely plausible that skills like carving existed within their walls. Historians still debate the precise meaning and intention behind the most explicit carvings. Were they intended as moral warnings against the sins of the flesh, meant to shock the viewer into piety? Were they visual jokes or expressions of frustration or rebellion against the strictures of monastic life? Were they simply a reflection of the broader medieval world's more open, if complex, attitude towards the body and sexuality? Or perhaps, as some suggest, they served as a form of visual release, a way to acknowledge and perhaps diffuse the very human desires that were suppressed by vows. The lack of accompanying texts or explanations leaves us guessing, piecing together clues from the carvings themselves and other historical sources. It's like finding a strange, anonymous doodle on your office desk that's been there for 800 years and trying to figure out who drew it and why. The fact that these carvings exist at all, hidden away in places of worship, tells us something fundamental about the medieval era and the people who lived through it. Their world wasn't neatly divided into sacred and profane in the way we often think. Earthy realities, humor, satire, and yes, even explicit imagery could coexist within religious spaces, sometimes openly, sometimes tucked away like these misericords. They weren't necessarily seen as automatically defiling the space, or perhaps their location, out of sight, made them permissible. You have to remember the medieval context. Images were powerful teachers and communicators in a largely illiterate society. They could convey complex ideas, morals, or simply reflect the world as people saw it, in all its messy, vibrant, sometimes awkward, glory. And when we focus on the convents, on the nuns who lived and prayed there, the question becomes even more pointed. These women were, in theory, dedicated to lives free from worldly temptations, focused purely on the spiritual. To find such carvings in their space feels particularly jarring. It forces us to look beyond the stereotype of the demure, passive nun and consider the complex inner lives and potential expressions of women living under strict vows in a patriarchal society. Were these carvings a subversion, a coping mechanism, or something else entirely? That's the quiet mystery that hangs in the air of these old churches, waiting for you to ponder. You lean in closer, the scent of old wood and dust filling your nostrils, examining the details of a carving that speaks volumes, yet remains utterly silent about its own origins and meaning. You're still there, in that quiet choir, the weight of the carved wood seat heavy in your hand before you gently lower it back into place. The erotic image you just saw is once again hidden, tucked away, a secret shared only between you and the silent stones. It's almost like it wasn't there at all, which just amplifies the strangeness. To truly understand why these carvings are so perplexing, you need to step back from the immediate shock of the image and immerse yourself in the daily reality of the people who spent their lives in this space. You need to understand what life was like behind these cloistered walls for a medieval nun. Imagine yourself taking those vows. You're likely a woman from a reasonably well-off family. Convents weren't usually for the destitute, as there was often an entrance dowry required, a sum of money or property given to the convent upon your admission. Think of it as a medieval enrollment fee, though instead of getting a degree, you got eternal salvation. Hopefully. You might have entered as a child, dedicated by your family, or perhaps as an adult seeking spiritual fulfillment, escaping a difficult marriage, or avoiding marriage altogether. Whatever the reason, your life changes fundamentally the moment you commit. Your world shrinks, physically and socially. The high walls surrounding the convent are not just architectural features. They are boundaries defining your existence. Contact with the outside world is strictly limited, often only allowed through grills or in designated parlors under supervision. Your family might visit occasionally, but your primary community, your entire social universe, is now within these walls. The other nuns, the abbess who leads the community, perhaps some lay sisters or servants who handle the more mundane tasks. And your time? It's no longer your own. It belongs to and it is rigorously scheduled. The heart of convent life, the rhythm that dictates every hour, is the divine office, that opus dei we mentioned. You would rise in the deep dark hours of the night, maybe 2 a.m. for matins, the longest service. Then after a brief rest, back to the chapel for lauds at dawn. Throughout the day, at roughly 3-hour intervals, you'd gather again for prime, terce, sex, nun, vespers, and finally compline before retiring for the night, often around sunset. That's 8 services a day, every single day, a relentless cycle of prayer, psalmody, and scripture meetings. You spend hours in those choir stalls, standing, kneeling, singing, listening. It's physically demanding. Your voice joins dozens of others in the ancient chants, filling the space with sound, creating an auditory tapestry that has echoed through these walls for centuries. You might feel the cold of the stone floor through your simple shoes, the stiffness in your knees after kneeling, the ache in your back from standing. This constant presence in the chapel, this dedication of time and energy to liturgical worship, is a mainstream historical fact about monastic life. It was the primary work. Between services, there's manual labor. Medieval convents weren't contemplative retreats in the modern sense. They were active communities. You might work in the convent's gardens, cultivating herbs for medicinal purposes or vegetables for the refectory table. You could be involved in tasks like cleaning, cooking, mending clothes, or caring for the sick. Some convents were centers of learning, where nuns copied manuscripts, illuminated texts, or even composed their own writings. Others might run schools for local girls or manage estates. So your hands weren't just folded in prayer, they were busy hands, shaping the physical world of the convent. Mealtimes are communal, often eaten in silence in the refectory, with one nun reading aloud from a religious text. The food is simple, often vegetarian, especially during periods of fasting like Lent or Advent, which together could make up half the year. Meat was generally forbidden and luxuries were rare. You're living a life of material simplicity, adhering to that vow of poverty. You own nothing personally, everything belongs to the community. Your habit, your meager possessions, even the bed you sleep on, they are not yours. And then there are the vows that directly relate to the kind of carvings we're looking at: chastity and obedience. Chastity meant a complete renunciation of sexual activity and often, by extension, intense emotional or romantic attachments. You were spouse of Christ, your love and devotion solely directed towards the divine. This wasn't just about refraining from sex, it was about a spiritual reorientation, a deliberate effort to live a life unfettered by earthly desires and relationships. Obedience meant submitting your will entirely to the authority of the abbess and the rules of the order. Your daily activities, your interactions, even seemingly small decisions, were potentially subject to the convent's discipline. You didn't question, you obeyed. Imagine living under these conditions, a life dictated by the bell calling you to prayer at all hours, a constant presence of others, little to no privacy, simple food, physical labor, and a strict suppression of personal desires, particularly sexual ones. The emphasis was on humility, self-denial, and conformity to the community's rules and spiritual goals. It sounds, well, let's be honest, exhausting and incredibly restrictive by modern standards. You couldn't just pop out for a coffee with a friend, scroll mindlessly on your phone for an hour, or have a quiet evening to yourself. Your life was lived in the open, in the communal space under the watchful eyes of Good and your sisters. This context is crucial. These women whose lives were so carefully regulated, so focused on spiritual discipline and the renunciation of worldly pleasures, were the ones using these choir stalls daily. They sat on these seats, leaned on these misericords during long services. The carvings hidden beneath were part of their immediate environment. Given the extreme emphasis on chastity and the suppression of earthly desires, finding explicit erotic imagery in their personal, albeit shared, sacred space seems utterly bewildering. It's the equivalent of finding a hidden collection of racy pulp fiction tucked away in a monastery scriptorium. It just doesn't compute on the surface. One quirky or fringe tidbit about medieval convent life is the concept of spiritual marriage, or mystical marriage. While the vows were about renouncing earthly relationships, some nuns, through intense prayer and contemplation, experienced profound mystical connections with Christ, sometimes described in language that sounds, to modern ears, surprisingly intimate and even sensual, albeit framed entirely within a spiritual context. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Mechthild of Magdeburg wrote about visions and feelings for the divine that transcended the purely intellectual and bordered on the ecstatic. So while physical desire was suppressed, spiritual yearning could take forms that used surprisingly earthy language, adding another layer of complexity to how sexuality and spirituality intersected in the medieval mind. It's like your earthly love life is canceled, but your heavenly one is getting intense. Historians still argue whether the primary impulse behind these erotic carvings in convents was clerical commission for lay craftsmen, monastic self-expression, or even a form of visual coping mechanism? Was it the priest or bishop visiting who commissioned them to perhaps remind the nuns of the sins they were avoiding, which seems, shall we say, counterproductive? Were the nuns themselves involved in creating them, perhaps as a clandestine outlet for thoughts and feelings they were otherwise forbidden to express? Or were they created by lay craftswomen or men hired for the job, simply reflecting the broader, sometimes bawdy, visual culture of the time, with the location being almost incidental, or perhaps even added without full knowledge or approval of the convent residents? The lack of clear documentation makes pinning down the who and the why incredibly difficult, leaving it open to scholarly debate and interpretation. Consider the potential psychological landscape. Living a life of such rigid discipline, suppressing fundamental human drives, could create intense internal pressure. Was there an unspoken understanding, a quiet acknowledgement within the community that while outwardly chaste, the human mind still wandered? Could these hidden carvings have served a purpose, perhaps as a visual representation of the temptations being overcome, or even, daringly, a private space for acknowledging the suppressed aspects of self? You see how the strictness of the life clashes so dramatically with the freedom suggested by the carvings. The silence of the refectory, the endless hours of standing in the choir, the communal living with no private space for personal expression, and then lift the seat and find a world of hidden, explicit imagery. It forces you to question our assumptions about the past, about religious life, and about the inner lives of medieval women. They weren't just passive recipients of spiritual discipline, they were human beings navigating complex internal and external landscapes. Think about the sheer persistence required for their lifestyle. The cold, the hunger, the lack of sleep during night offices, the constant demands of prayer and work. It builds a picture of resilience, certainly, but also potentially of strain. What happens when that strain bumps up against the strictures of vows? Perhaps these carvings are a tiny, wooden crack in the facade of perfect piety, a glimpse into the thoughts and feelings that were not so easily suppressed by habit and rule. The benches themselves become silent witnesses to this tension. They are utilitarian objects, designed for long hours of worship and physical relief. But the hidden art transforms them into something else, repositories of secrets, perhaps unintentional outlets for expression, or deliberate, if private, statements. They remind us that even in the most controlled environments, human nature finds ways to manifest, sometimes in the most unexpected places and forms. You run your hand lightly over the smooth, aged wood of the stall, feeling the grooves and contours left by tools centuries ago, imagining the hands that shaped them, and the lives lived within their silent, wooden embrace. You're still running your hand over the smooth, cool wood of the choir stall, feeling the history embedded in the grain. You notice how the seat isn't fixed down like a pew bench. Instead, it's hinged, designed to be lifted up. As you lift the seat, you reveal that small, protruding shelf underneath, often intricately carved. That's the misericord. The name itself is derived from the Latin word misericordia, meaning mercy. So you're looking at a mercy seat, and after hours on your feet chanting psalms and listening to scripture in the cold stone building, your knees would certainly be begging for a little mercy. The primary practical purpose of these misericords is a mainstream historical fact about monastic and cathedral choirs throughout the Middle Ages. During certain parts of the divine office or the Mass, the clergy and monastics were required to stand for extended periods. We're talking potentially hours upon hours throughout the day in 8 separate services, remember? Standing straight and still for that long is incredibly tiring, even if you're spiritually fortified. So these small ledges were designed to allow you to subtly lean, taking some weight off your feet and legs without appearing to be fully sitting. You would lift the seat up, turn slightly, and lean your backside against the misericord. From a distance, especially to the presiding clergy or the abbess, you would still appear to be standing. It was a quiet, almost invisible act of physical relief, a small concession to human frailty in the midst of rigorous spiritual discipline. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of subtly shifting your weight from one foot to the other during a long meeting, except slightly more engineered. These stalls and their hidden misericords became essential furniture in any significant church or monastic choir. They were usually arranged in rows along the north and south sides of the choir, often facing inward towards the altar or lectern. In a convent choir, these would be where the nuns spent a huge proportion of their waking hours. Day after day, year after year, generation after generation, they would lift these seats, lean on these misericords, seeking that small comfort from the physical demands of their prayer life. And every time they did, if the misericord was carved, they would be confronted, however fleetingly, with the image carved beneath. Now, while the function of the misericord is purely practical, a place to lean your weary bones, the decision to decorate them, and especially to decorate them with such a vast and varied array of imagery, is where things get interesting. Why go to the trouble of carving intricate designs on a shelf that's usually hidden beneath a seat? It wasn't for public display in the way stained glass or altarpieces were. It was, in a sense, private art, visible primarily to the person using the stall, and perhaps the few people standing or leaning next to them. This hidden nature is key to the puzzle. The types of carvings found on misericords across Europe are astonishingly diverse. You find religious imagery, of course, scenes from the Bible, lives of saints, symbols of Christian belief. This seems entirely appropriate for the location. But you also find a huge amount of secular imagery. Carvings depicting everyday life are common. Scenes of farming, hunting, cooking, people playing music, dancing, or engaged in various medieval trades. There are also fantastical creatures, mythical beasts, griffins, dragons, hybrids of humans and animals, often referred to as grotesques. Some carvings are moralistic, depicting proverbs or fables, while others seem purely humorous or satirical. You might find a scene of a wife beating her husband or animals mimicking human behavior, like monkeys doctoring a patient. It's a whole hidden world of medieval popular culture tucked away beneath those seats. And then you find the ones that really make you pause. The explicitly sexual or erotic carvings. These aren't just suggestive. Sometimes they are frankly graphic depictions of sexual acts, nudity, or exaggerated sexual organs. Finding these mixed in with saints and domestic scenes and funny monkeys is what makes the misericords in convents so perplexing. It's this strange juxtaposition of the sacred space, the ascetic lives of the users, and the sometimes surprisingly profane imagery carved into their mercy seats. Consider the craftsmanship involved. These weren't quick, rough sketches. Many misericords are incredibly detailed, skillfully executed works of art carved from solid wood, often oak. The carvers had to be highly skilled artisans. While some monasteries or convents might have had members of the community with carving talents, it's much more common for these major architectural and furniture pieces to have been commissioned from lay craftsmen or workshops. Imagine being a professional woodcarver in the 14th or 15th century. You get a commission to carve misericords for a convent choir. You're given the basic specifications for the furniture, but perhaps you're given some freedom on the decoration, or perhaps specific themes are requested. The payment wasn't based on the number of hours you leaned on the seat, but on the intricate detail you could produce. One quirky or fringe tidbit about misericord carvings is just how personal some of them seem. While many follow standard iconographic patterns, there are examples that appear to be inside jokes, specific local references, or even portraits of individuals. Perhaps the craftsmen themselves or people they knew. There's one famous misericord carvings that depicts a man pulling a thorn from a lion's paw, a scene from the fable of Androcles and the lion. Others show popular medieval stories or characters not necessarily from religious texts. It's almost as if the carvers saw these hidden spaces as a canvas for their own world, a place where they could inject a bit of humor, social commentary, or sheer weirdness that might not be acceptable on the main altar screen. It's like the medieval equivalent of drawing something funny on the underside of your school desk, except way, way better carved, obviously. The question of why such a vast range of secular and sometimes scandalous imagery ended up in sacred spaces, specifically on misericords, is complex, and historians still debate the precise iconography and intent behind many of these secular or marginal carvings. Were they simply decorative, reflecting the popular tastes and visual language of the time? Was the hidden location seen as less sensitive than publicly visible art? Were they intended as moral lessons, depicting follies or sins to be avoided? Even the erotic ones, a rather elaborate way to make that point, if so. Or were they, in some cases, simply the product of a carver's imagination, maybe even their own sense of humor or personal interest, given a degree of artistic license in a less prominent location? The fact that these carvings are located under the seat, only visible when the seat is lifted for leaning, adds another layer to the mystery. It suggests the primary audience was the person using the stall. Were these carvings meant to provide a moment of visual distraction during long services? A brief glimpse of the outside world or the fantastical? For the nuns whose lives were so cloistered, perhaps the secular scenes offered a tiny window into the life they had left behind, or the world that continued outside the convent walls. For the erotic carvings specifically, the hidden location seems even more significant. It's not something for the abbess to see walking by. It's for the individual nun leaning there. Consider the physical act. You stand up, lift your seat, turn and lean. Your gaze falls onto the carving just beneath your backside. It's a private moment despite being in a shared space. What went through the mind of a nun seeing, perhaps for the thousandth time, an image that directly contradicted the vows of chastity she had taken? Was it a test, a temptation, an uncomfortable reality check on the human condition, or something else entirely? The sheer variety of carvings confirms that misericords were seen as spaces where artistic freedom, within certain bounds, was permitted or tolerated. They are a fascinating source for understanding medieval life, culture, and even humor in a way that more formal, public religious art often isn't. They show us that medieval people, even those living lives of strict piety, had a complex visual world that included the mundane, the fantastical, the moralistic, and yes, the earthy and explicit. These pieces of carved wood aren't just furniture, they are historical documents, offering glimpses into the minds of the artists who created them and the lives of the people who use them daily. The question now is to try and understand specifically why the erotic carvings appear in these places used by these women. What possible meaning could they have held? What did they signify in a community dedicated to the renunciation of earthly pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure? You trace the lines of the carving again, feeling the smooth wear of centuries of hands and habits against the raised wood, wondering about the secrets they hold. You pull your hand away from the carving, the wood cool and smooth under your fingertips, a stark contrast to the imagined rough wool of a nun's habit. You've seen the seat lifted, understood the mercy it offered weary legs during interminable hours of standing prayer. Now try to step into the life of the women who use these very stalls, day in, day out, year after year. What was it actually like to live behind those stone walls, dedicated entirely to God? What were the daily realities, the constraints, the inner life that might have intersected with those hidden carvings? This is where the mainstream historical fact about medieval convent life comes into sharp focus: the absolute centrality of the divine office, or the liturgy of the hours. This wasn't just a part of their day. It was their day structured around a rigorous schedule of prayer services spread throughout the 24 hours. You started the day in the dead of night, maybe around 2 a.m., with matins and lauds. Imagine being jolted awake from a thin mattress on a cold stone floor, stumbling in the dark to the choir stall, your body still heavy with sleep, to begin hours of chanting psalms and reading scripture. Then a brief rest, perhaps before primate dawn, followed by terce, sext and none during the day, vespers in the late afternoon, and finally compline before retiring for the night. 8 services every single day, rain or shine, sick or well, for decades. Between these set times of communal prayer, there would be periods for manual labor, study, spiritual reading, and necessary tasks like tending the gardens, working in the scriptorium, copying manuscripts, or managing the convent's property and finances. Some convents were considerable landowners, But the rhythm was always dictated by the bell calling you back to the choir. Your physical and mental energy were constantly channeled towards spiritual discipline and communal religious practice. Think about your busiest days, where your calendar is packed from morning till night. Now imagine almost every slot being filled with mandatory attendance at a religious service, requiring physical presence and mental focus, even when your body screamed for rest or your mind wandered. It wasn't a 9 to 5, it was a 24/7 commitment with little downtime that wasn't also structured or dedicated to contemplation. Entering a convent meant taking solemn vows: poverty, chastity, and obedience. Poverty meant renouncing personal possessions. Everything belonged to the community. Obedience meant submitting your will to the abbess or prioress, seen as God's representative, and to the rules of the order. Chastity meant renouncing marriage and sexual relations, dedicating your physical body and desires solely to God. For women in the Middle Ages, this was a profound choice, often the only respectable alternative to marriage. It offered a different kind of life, sometimes one of greater education and agency than was available to married women. But it came with immense personal sacrifice. The vow of chastity, particularly, was not just about abstaining from sex. It was about cultivating a state of spiritual purity, guarding against impure thoughts and desires. Nuns were constantly reminded to be vigilant against the temptations of the flesh and the world. Their spiritual writings, sermons they heard, and rules they followed all emphasized the importance of this struggle. Living in a community of women, separate from men, was designed to help maintain this state of purity, but the internal battle against natural human desires was a constant theme in monastic literature. Then there's the constraint of the cloister. For many orders, particularly after reforms in the later Middle Ages, strict enclosure became the norm. This meant nuns were physically confined within the convent walls. They couldn't leave, and outsiders, especially men, had very limited access, often only speaking through grilles or windows. This physical separation from the secular world was intended to create a sacred space, free from worldly distractions and temptations, allowing total focus on the divine. But imagine the psychological impact of this enforced isolation. No spontaneous trips, no visiting family freely, no experiencing the bustling life of the nearby town or village. Your world shrank to the confines of the cloister, the faces of the other nuns, the internal landscape of your own mind and soul. Living in such close proximity with the same group of people, under strict rules, with limited external stimulation, could create its own unique pressures. Interpersonal dynamics, petty annoyances, unresolvable conflicts, the sheer monotony. These things become magnified in a confined space. You might find yourself staring at the same crack in the wall during prayer because looking at the nun next to you is too distracting, or worse, she got on your nerves during supper. And speaking of rules, a quirky or fringe tidbit about monastic discipline is how incredibly specific and sometimes peculiar they could be, often designed to reinforce inward focus and humility. Some monastic rules specifically instructed monks and nuns not to look up during services or manual labor, keeping their gaze lowered. The idea was to avoid distraction, maintain humility, and focus internally or on the task at hand. Imagine being told not to raise your eyes from the ground or your book or your hands working on embroidery. Your visual world becomes very small, limited to what is directly in front of you or below your eye level. This seemingly small rule, keeping your gaze cast downwards, suddenly makes those misericord carvings potentially more significant. If you are constantly reminded not to look up, not to look around, but to keep your eyes lowered, where do your eyes naturally fall when you lift that seat and lean? Directly onto the carving beneath you. It was, perhaps unintentionally, one of the few visual points of interest available within that enforced narrow field of vision during the long hours in the choir. It was a hidden tableau, a microstage presenting images when the wider world was deliberately shut out. The psychological pressures were manifold. There was the pressure to conform, to be a perfect nun, to constantly strive for spiritual perfection. There was the suppression of natural human desires, emotions, and connections that didn't fit the monastic ideal. There was the potential for boredom or listlessness in the face of routine. And there was the internal conflict between the demands of the spirit and the frailties of the flesh. Was this chosen life always a source of peace and fulfillment? Or did it sometimes feel like a cage, amplifying inner turmoil? Historians still argue whether medieval convent life was primarily a path to spiritual liberation and personal fulfillment for women, offering education, community, and purpose outside of patriarchal marriage structures, or if the strict enclosure, physical rigors, and suppression of individual identity constituted a form of confinement and hardship, potentially leading to psychological distress. The truth, of course, is likely somewhere in the middle, varying greatly depending on the individual, the specific convent, the abbess, and the historical period. But regardless of whether a nun found profound peace or struggled daily, her life was one of intense structure, rigorous self-discipline, and significant renunciation of the secular world and physical pleasures, particularly sexual ones. You had given your life and body to God. You spent your days in prayer, work, and contemplation, physically separated from the very world depicted in some of those carvings beneath your seat. It's like trying to quit sugar and finding a secret stash of donuts hidden underneath your office chair. A tiny, illicit reminder of the thing you've given up, visible only to you in a moment of physical relief. Except, less doughy and potentially more salvation-threatening. Or maybe just a strange joke carved by some long-dead artisan. Who knows? The contrast between the ideals of convent life, purity, spiritual focus, renunciation, and the earthy, sometimes explicitly sexual imagery found on some misericords is striking. What did it mean for a woman who had vowed perpetual chastity to lean daily on a small shelf, carved with figures engaged in sexual acts, or displaying exaggerated genitalia? Was it a deliberate challenge? A test? An uncomfortable mirror reflecting the human condition, even within the sacred space? Or were these images viewed through a different lens entirely? Perhaps allegorical or symbolic in ways that are lost to us now? You sit back slightly, picturing the quiet, contained world of the cloister, the repetitive cycle of prayer and work, the inward focus, and wonder how such a world could accommodate or even tolerate such unexpected glimpses of the profane. It's a puzzle etched in wood, waiting for an answer. You're left there in the quiet space of the mental cloister you've been trying to inhabit, staring at the contrast, the ascetic ideal of a nun's life set against the potential wildness carved in wood beneath a lifting seat. How did this happen? How did these earthy, sometimes baffling images end up in such a sacred, controlled environment? It wasn't like the nuns themselves were sneaking out at night with chisels and mallets, giggling as they etched crude drawings. These were professionally carved pieces of church furniture. To understand the carvings, you need to step back from the individual nun and her seat and look at the bigger picture of medieval church construction and furnishing. These choir stalls, complete with their misericords, weren't just thrown together overnight. They were significant investments, commissioned works of art and craftsmanship, part of the overall design and decoration of a cathedral, abbey, or convent church. This is where the history of the objects themselves and the people who made and paid for them becomes crucial. Misericords themselves weren't purely decorative at first. As we touched on before, their primary function was practical, to provide a tiny ledge, a seat of mercy, for clergy or choir members to lean against during the extremely long periods of standing required during services. If you've ever stood for hours on end, say at a concert or waiting in a ridiculously long queue at the DMV, you know your legs start to feel like overcooked spaghetti after a while. Now imagine doing that multiple times a day, every day, for years, while also needing to maintain concentration for prayer and chanting. The ability to subtly perch, shifting your weight onto that narrow shelf when the seat was tilted up, was a genuine physical relief. The name misericord comes from the Latin word for mercy or pity, which makes perfect sense when your knees are screaming for a break. These mercy seats began appearing in significant numbers from the 13th century onwards, becoming a standard feature of choir stalls in many churches across Europe. And as church interiors became more elaborate, so did the carvings beneath these seats. They weren't limited to convents, of course. They are found in cathedrals and monasteries used by monks and secular clergy too. But the presence of the more eyebrow-raising imagery in places dedicated to female religious life adds an extra layer of intrigue. So who actually made these things? The carving of choir stalls was highly skilled work, typically undertaken by professional woodcarvers. These weren't usually members of the monastic community or the clergy themselves. While some monasteries might have had skilled brethren, large, complex projects like fitting out an entire choir were usually contracted out to lay craftsmen. These carvers were part of a vibrant tradition of medieval artistry, often organized into guilds in towns and cities. They were skilled tradespeople working with specific tools, gouges, chisels, mallets, transforming raw wood into intricate forms. Imagine them arriving at the construction site or workshop near the abbey. They'd bring their tools, their expertise, and their experience gained from working on various projects, perhaps other churches, but also secular buildings, furniture, or other wooden objects. They were part of the outside world, carrying its images, stories, and perspectives with them, literally bringing them into the sacred space through their craft. They weren't necessarily deeply versed in theological minutiae or monastic rules. They were artists and artisans, focused on executing a commission, perhaps given some general direction, but possibly also left to their own devices for the smaller, less prominent carvings like those under the seats. Now, who paid for all this? Who commissioned these elaborate choir stalls? This is where the patrons come in. Church building and furnishing in the Middle Ages was incredibly expensive. Major works were often funded by wealthy patrons, kings, queens, powerful nobles, rich merchants, who saw it as a way to express their piety, gain spiritual merit, and also perhaps display their wealth and status. Think of it like sponsoring a wing of a museum today, but with a direct line to heaven. Church officials, like bishops or abbots, also commissioned work, using church funds or their own resources. And monastic communities themselves, if they were sufficiently wealthy from land holdings, gifts, or other revenues, might finance their own furnishings. When a wealthy patron or an abbot commissioned choir stalls, they would likely have had significant input on the overall design, the general style, the materials, the main carvings visible to everyone, like the bench ends or the canopies above the stalls. These prominent carvings often depicted saints, biblical scenes, or the coats of arms of the patrons. But what about the hidden world under the seats, the misericords? Did the patrons or the commissioning clergy specify the subject matter for each tiny carving? Or was this left to the discretion of the master carver and his workshop? This brings us squarely to one of the major areas of scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the imagery on misericords was primarily dictated by the patrons or clergy, or if the carvers themselves had significant artistic license in choosing the subjects. There are strong arguments for both sides. On the one hand, it seems unlikely that patrons or church authorities would be completely indifferent to any decoration within a sacred building, especially something as potentially problematic as some of the carvings we're talking about. They might have provided themes, perhaps biblical stories, moral fables, or symbols relevant to the order or patron saint. On the other hand, the sheer variety, quirkiness, and sometimes baffling nature of misericord carvings across different churches suggest a degree of freedom for the carvers. These craftsmen had their own repertoire of designs, drawing from popular culture, fables like Aesop's, proverbs, tales of everyday life, mythical creatures, and yes, sometimes outright crude or humorous scenes. If the carvers were given a brief like, carve something appropriate for the hidden underside, they might have interpreted that quite broadly, perhaps using stock designs they had, or even injecting a bit of their own personality and sense of humor into the work. A mainstream historical fact that provides context here is understanding the intensely visual nature of medieval culture and the role of art in churches. For a population where literacy was not widespread, images were powerful tools for teaching, reminding, and inspiring. Stained glass windows, wall paintings, sculptures, and yes, carvings all served to tell stories from the Bible, the lives of saints, and moral lessons. While misericords were hidden, they were part of this larger visual landscape. Some scholars argue that even the seemingly profane images had didactic purposes, perhaps illustrating the folly of worldly pursuits, the dangers of sin, or the chaos of a world without God's order. It's like medieval clickbait. You won't believe what these animals are doing. Spoiler, it's a warning about gluttony. But let's be honest, some of the images are hard to interpret solely as moral lessons without a significant stretch. This leads us to a quirky or fringe tidbit. Among the common themes found on misericords are bizarre hybrid creatures, animals acting like humans, and scenes of everyday life that seem utterly unconnected to spiritual matters. You might find a monkey playing the bagpipes, a rabbit jousting a knight, a woman beating her husband, a surprisingly common motif, people drinking, juggling, or even scenes depicting crude physical acts. One theory, leaning towards the carver's agency, is that these represented the carver's own world, their sense of humor, or served as inside jokes within the carving community. Perhaps they were a subtle form of medieval graffiti, a way for the working-class artisans to leave their mark, and a bit of cheeky rebellion or commentary within the hallowed halls they were beautifying. After all, who was really going to be lifting every single seat and scrutinizing the hidden underside? Mostly the tired clergy and nuns, right? Maybe it was a visual wink just for them. Yeah, we know life in here is tough. Here's a reminder of the ridiculous world outside. Or maybe just a picture of a cat reading a book because, why not? Another interpretation for the tolerance of these images, particularly in a religious context, is the idea that they served as a counterpoint to the sacred. By depicting the folly, sin, or absurdity of the secular world, they implicitly highlighted the holiness and order of the sacred space in the religious life. They were a reminder of what the religious had renounced, or perhaps even a psychological pressure release valve, a moment of visual absurdity in a life of intense seriousness. It's like those weird internet memes you look at during a boring work meeting, a fleeting, slightly illicit moment of connection to something entirely different from your current reality. Except these were carved in oak. Consider the nuns again. If the patrons were external, say a wealthy lord or lady funding the new choir stalls for a convent church, they might have approved the overall scheme but paid less attention to the hidden details. The abbess might have focused on ensuring the layout and primary carvings were appropriate, perhaps not inspecting the misericords closely until they were installed. And once they were there, under the seats, visible only to the user, maybe they were simply accepted as part of the furniture, their meaning debated or ignored. It's hard to imagine a nun marching up to the abbess and saying, "Excuse me, mother, but the carving under my seat depicts a man mooning a bear. Is this theologically sound?" Though you do hope someone somewhere had that conversation. The carvers, likely traveling from town to town for work, would have had pattern books or memories filled with common motifs. They were skilled artisans, but they were also part of a popular culture that included bawdy tales, folk wisdom, and visual jokes. Bringing these elements into a church, especially in a hidden location, might not have seemed scandalous to them, or perhaps they banked on them not being noticed or complained about. It's a bit like an architect designing a building and leaving a tiny funny doodle in a hidden corner during the construction phase. It's there, it's a deliberate act, but it's not intended for grand display. So you have this complex interplay, the need for a functional object, the misericord, the skill of lay craftsmen, the piety and aspirations of patrons, and the receiving environment of the religious institution. The blend of sacred and profane imagery on misericords is not unique to convents, but its presence in places dedicated to female chastity and spiritual rigor is particularly potent. It begs the question, did the women who use these seats see the carvings, shrug, and think, "Ah, the carver must have had a rough day"? Or did these images, hidden and personal, spark internal conflict, amusement, or even a strange form of connection to the world they had left behind? The wood itself holds the image, but not the answer to the feeling it evoked in the heart of a medieval nun leaning against it during matins. It's a silent testament to the messiness of the human experience, even within the most structured and sacred of lives. You're still there, metaphorically crouched under the choir seat, tracing the strange lines of that hidden image. You've seen the hands that made it, the wealth that paid for the stalls in the context of medieval art. But now you lift your head just a fraction and look up, past the turned-up seat, past the smooth wood of the stall itself, into the space occupied by the person who used this seat. You look into the life of a medieval nun. Her life, the one she deliberately chose, was structured down to the hour, governed by bells and rules designed to focus the mind and spirit entirely on God. It was a life of renunciation, of leaving the chaotic, tempting, often messy world behind to seek a higher form of order and spiritual purity within the cloister walls. Forget your modern ideas of downtime or personal hobbies. A nun's day was a relentless cycle of prayer, work, and contemplation. Imagine waking up in the dark long before dawn, often in unheated dormitories where the cold stones seeped into your very bones. The first bell would ring, pulling you from sleep into the silent, purposeful shuffle towards the chapel for matins and lauds, the first services of the day. You'd stand, or maybe lean on that little misericord for hours, chanting psalms, listening to readings, praying. The air would be cold and thick with the smell of old stone and beeswax candles. Your voice would blend with dozens of others, a low, resonant hum filling the vast, dim space. This wasn't a quick prayer before breakfast. This was a significant chunk of the night dedicated to the divine office. After a short break, often back to the cold dormitory, the bell would call again for prime at sunrise. Then came terce, sext, and nun, marking roughly the mid-morning, midday, and mid-afternoon. Each service meant returning to the choir stalls, more standing, more chanting, more prayer. In between these fixed points of communal worship, there would be work, manual labor essential for the running of the convent. This could be anything from tending gardens to provide food and medicinal herbs, to spinning and weaving fabric for habits and linens, to copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, or caring for the sick within the infirmary, or even the poor and infirm from the local community who might seek help at the convent gates. Their lives were meticulously planned, leaving little room for idleness, which was seen as the devil's workshop. Even meals were often taken in silence, with one sister reading aloud from scripture or a spiritual text. There were specific times for private prayer, for study, and for necessary rest, but all within a framework of strict rules regarding behavior, dress, and interaction. Silence was often emphasized as a discipline intended to quiet the chatter of the mind and the distractions of the world, making space for contemplation. This was a life aiming for spiritual perfection, for a constant state of devotion and humility. You were expected to subdue your worldly desires, your individual will, even your personal comforts. Your identity was largely subsumed into the community and your relationship with God. The architecture of the convent itself reinforced this. Enclosed spaces, high walls, barred windows, designed to separate the religious from the outside world and its temptations, both physical and spiritual. And yet here, tucked away beneath the very seat you used multiple times a day while striving for this spiritual elevation, was a little window into that world you had supposedly left behind. A scene of peasants drinking, a fantastical creature, a slightly rude gesture, or, yes, maybe even something that hints at earthy desires or physical comedy. It's the ultimate contrast, the austere, ordered, silent pursuit of the divine above, and the boisterous, chaotic, sometimes crude reality of the human and natural world hidden just inches below. How did these women, living lives of such rigorous piety and renunciation, engage with these carvings? Historians still argue whether the nuns simply ignored these hidden images, saw them as meaningless decoration, or found some private significance, amusement, or even challenge in them. It seems highly unlikely they could use the seats daily for years and never once notice the carving beneath. The question is what that notice meant to them. Maybe for some, these carvings were just part of the furniture, like the grain in the wood or the dust in the corners, background noise in a life focused elsewhere. They were under the seat, out of public view, or even convent view mostly, not part of the important, visible iconography of the church like the altar or the statues of saints. Perhaps they were simply accepted as a strange quirk from the carvers, a bit like finding a random sticker someone put on the bottom of a table. For others, perhaps these small, hidden images served as a secret, private connection to the world they had renounced. A humorous scene could be a tiny, illicit spark of amusement in a life of enforced seriousness. A depiction of a secular activity might evoke a memory of their lives before the convent walls closed in, a bittersweet or perhaps cautionary reminder. It's easy to imagine a young nun, missing her family or the simple pleasures of secular life, glancing down and seeing a carving of a village festival and feeling a pang of nostalgia, or perhaps a reaffirmation of her choice to leave such distractions behind. A mainstream historical fact about monastic life is the profound emphasis placed on humility and obedience. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monastic orders, including nuns, stressed the importance of submitting one's will to the abbess in the community and cultivating a spirit of self-denial and lowliness. This disciplined mindset would certainly shape how a nun approached everything in her environment. Would a nun trained in humility feel it was her place to question or even comment on the strange carving under her seat? Probably not openly, unless it was truly scandalous by the standards of the time. Silence and acceptance were virtues. But here's a quirky or fringe tidbit about medieval convents. Despite the rules, life wasn't always perfectly austere. Nuns, being human, sometimes found ways to bend or even break the rules in small ways. There are records of convents having pet animals, despite rules against personal possessions. Some nuns wrote letters filled with gossip or complaints. Occasionally, minor luxuries or forbidden foods would make their way into the cloister. This suggests that while the ideal was strict renunciation, the reality often involved a degree of human ingenuity in finding small comforts or diversions. Could the misericord carvings have served as one of these small, acceptable because hidden diversions? A silent joke shared between friends who occupied neighboring stalls and compared their weird little carvings. Oh, yours has a badger stealing pears? Mine has a monkey pulling a face. Consider the psychological impact. Living a life focused intensely on the spiritual, while suppressing worldly desires and emotions, is demanding. These hidden images could have functioned as a kind of pressure valve, a tiny private acknowledgement of the human reality that existed just outside or even inside the cloister's spiritual aspirations. They weren't openly displayed temptations, but subtle, often ambiguous images that might evoke a complex mix of recognition, amusement, or even pious disapproval, all within the privacy of leaning on your seat. It's like having a slightly weird screensaver on your computer at work, something only that offers a momentary flicker of something off-topic before you return to the serious business at hand. The contrast highlights the tension inherent in any form of extreme asceticism. Humans are embodied beings, connected to the physical world, to humor, to stories, to the slightly ridiculous. The monastic life sought to transcend this, to focus on the eternal and divine, but the carvers, coming from the world, brought its images with them. And the misericords, functional objects needed for physical support during long hours of spiritual exercise, became the perfect, hidden location for this collision of the sacred and the profane. Think about the cumulative effect. Day after day, year after year, leaning on that same seat, seeing that same bizarre or mundane image. It becomes part of the fabric of your daily experience, even if you don't actively think about it. It's just there. Perhaps it sparked internal dialogues, a temptation resisted, a fable recalled, a moment of absurdity appreciated. Or perhaps, for many, it was simply a curious piece of wood that provided a necessary bit of physical mercy during the long, demanding rhythm of prayer. The carvings might have been a tiny, unspoken acknowledgement that even within walls built for holiness, the echoes of the earthly world, in all its strangeness and vitality, could still find a place to perch. They are a testament to the enduring human capacity for finding or creating unexpected moments of connection to the broader world, even in the most devout and disciplined of lives. So you're still pondering, head tilted just so under the seat, thinking about the nun who used this stall. You've spent time in her world in the previous section, the bells, the cold stone, the endless cycle of prayer and work. the profound effort to orient every thought towards the divine. And now you're looking at this tiny, hidden image beneath her hands, or where her feet might have rested when the seat was up. How, in this life dedicated to spiritual transcendence, did she process this glimpse of the decidedly earthbound? Let's be honest, ignoring it completely seems unlikely, at least over years of daily use. Imagine using the same chair at work for a decade. Even if you never think about that little stain on the armrest or the slight wobble in one leg, you know it's there. It's part of the furniture's reality. Similarly, a nun leaning on her misericord day after day, year after year, chanting psalms and meditating on scripture, would surely eventually notice the carving beneath. The question isn't if they saw them, but how they saw them and what that seeing meant in the context of their rigorous lives. One possibility, and perhaps the one most favored by those who want to maintain a picture of unwavering medieval piety, is that the nuns simply viewed these as meaningless, perhaps even slightly regrettable, decorations put there by workmen and essentially filtered them out. Like background noise you learn to tune out. Their focus was elsewhere, on the liturgy, on their spiritual state. A carving of a monkey playing a pipe or a man wrestling a goat, irrelevant. Not part of the sacred space, not part of the sacred task. They were under the seat, after all, hidden away. Out of sight, mostly out of mind. This perspective suggests a strong, almost superhuman ability to compartmentalize, to focus so intensely on the spiritual that the material world, even when depicted right under their noses, held no sway or even interest. But consider the human element we touched on earlier. Nuns were not automatons. They were women from various backgrounds, with different personalities, senses of humor, levels of piety, and past experiences. They entered the convent for many reasons: deep faith, a desire for education. Convents were often centers of learning for women. Family pressure, or simply lack of other options. They brought their humanity with them, even as they strove to perfect their spirituality. So could they have found amusement in these carvings? Historians still argue whether the levity found in misericord carvings indicates a shared medieval sense of humor that spans social and religious divides, or if it represented a more complex interaction with worldly themes. Laughter was not forbidden in convents, though it was often regulated, generally discouraged during prayer or silence, but permitted during recreation periods. A private chuckle, stifled behind a hand while leaning on your misericord during a particularly lengthy sermon, seems entirely within the realm of human possibility. Seeing a carving of a slightly drunk peasant or a fox dressed as a bishop, a common, albeit satirical image, could certainly spark a moment of internal amusement. It's a bit like finding a hilarious meme saved on your phone that you can only look at when nobody's watching during a boring meeting. Perhaps these carvings offered a tiny, secret rebellion against the relentless seriousness of convent life. Not a major defiance, certainly not a challenge to the core tenets of their faith or their vows, but a small acknowledgement that life outside the cloister walls existed and was full of strange, sometimes funny, sometimes earthy things. It might have been a shared, unspoken language between nuns and neighboring stalls, a glance down, a slight smile exchanged when the abbess wasn't looking. "Oh, Sister Agnes, your mouse is still riding that snail. Mine's chasing a butterfly today." Okay, maybe that's a bit of a modern projection, but you get the idea. Then there's the possibility of private meaning. An image might resonate with a nun based on her life before the convent. A carving of rural life could evoke memories of her childhood home. An image of a specific animal might connect to a personal story or even a religious allegory she knew. Medieval people were very adept at symbolic interpretation. While many misericord carvings seem purely secular or comical to us, some might have held layers of meaning, possibly serving as visual reminders of parables, proverbs, or moral tales. A monkey, for example, was often associated with sin or folly in medieval art. Seeing a monkey carving might not just be funny, it could be a visual prompt for contemplation on resisting temptation or avoiding foolish behavior. A mainstream historical fact about medieval nuns is their engagement with spiritual literature beyond the Bible. Many convents had extensive libraries, and nuns read widely from the lives of saints, theological treatises, and devotional works. They were encouraged to contemplate and meditate on these texts, internalizing moral lessons and striving for spiritual growth. If they were reading stories filled with complex symbolism and allegories, it stands to reason they might look for or assign similar meaning to visual imagery, even the unexpected stuff under their seats. Consider the image not as decoration, but as a prompt, a carving of a struggling laborer, a reminder to be grateful for her own situation perhaps, or a call to prayer for those less fortunate in the world she had left. A carving of a wild creature, a prompt to reflect on the untamed aspects of human nature that needed to be disciplined through prayer and asceticism. It's like having a sticky note on your fridge that says, "Remember to be patient." The image, however strange, could trigger a spiritual reflection. And here's a quirky or fringe tidbit that feels relevant. Medieval manuscripts, including those painstakingly copied and sometimes illuminated by nuns in the scriptorium, are famous for their marginalia. These are drawings in the margins of the text, and they range from beautiful illustrations related to the content to utterly bizarre, unrelated, and often humorous scenes. Rabbits jousting, hybrid creatures, naked figures doing strange things, people literally mooning the reader. This practice of adding strange, often comical or secular imagery to otherwise sacred or serious texts shows a definite medieval inclination towards incorporating unexpected, sometimes irreverent, visuals in places where we moderns might expect only solemnity. If nuns were copying manuscripts with fighting snails in the margins, seeing a weird carving under their choir seat might not have been that shocking or out of character for the visual world they inhabited. It was just another example of the medieval tendency to blend the sacred and the secular, the serious and the silly, in ways that feel jarring to our modern sensibilities. So, did the nuns actively discuss these carvings? Probably not openly during formal hours. Silence was a discipline. But whispers during recreation, shared glances, pointing with an elbow when the abbess wasn't looking, these are plausible scenarios. The hidden nature of the carvings made them perfect for private observation or subtle, non-disruptive interaction. They weren't on the main altar for everyone to see and be distracted by. They were tucked away, personal to the occupant of the stall. Perhaps some nuns found the carvings challenging or even slightly scandalous. The erotic imagery, while rare compared to the secular or comical, certainly existed. For a woman who had taken vows of chastity, seeing such a depiction, however stylized or small, might have been a source of temptation or discomfort. It could have served as a reminder of the desires she had explicitly renounced, perhaps prompting extra prayer or penance. Or, seen through the lens of medieval allegory, even potentially erotic images might have been interpreted symbolically, not as a literal depiction of sexual activity, but as a symbol of spiritual struggle, the temptations of the flesh, or even the complexities of human relationships in the secular world. Medieval symbolism could be incredibly layered and sometimes baffling to us today. Think about the psychological landscape of the convent again. A life of intense focus, rigid structure, and emotional discipline. These small carvings could have been tiny points of connection to the broader human experience, anchors to a reality that wasn't solely spiritual. They could have provided moments of levity, prompts for reflection, or even just something mundane to look at when deep contemplation felt out of reach. They were a constant, quiet presence, part of the furniture of their spiritual lives, yet holding echoes of the world they had left behind. Ultimately, how each individual nun perceived these carvings likely varied immensely. For some, they might have been invisible background noise. For others, a source of private amusement. For others still, prompts for spiritual reflection or reminders of temptations overcome. We don't have their diaries explicitly detailing their reactions, sadly. We can only infer based on what we know of medieval life, monastic rules, the nature of the carvings, and the human condition. The fact that these carvings exist in such profusion and were often added as part of the original construction or later renovation suggests they weren't seen as fundamentally incompatible with a sacred space, even if they were hidden away. They were perhaps an accepted part of the visual tapestry of the time, even within walls dedicated to God. They offer a powerful reminder that even in the most disciplined and seemingly otherworldly environments, human nature persists, curious, sometimes irreverent, capable of finding meaning or amusement in the most unexpected places. The nun's interaction with these carvings, whatever it may have been, adds a layer of quiet personal intrigue to the grand public performance of medieval piety. It's a secret conversation between the carver's world and the nun's world, happening silently, just inches below the solemn posture of prayer. So, you've considered the nun, her life of discipline, and how she might have processed the peculiar imagery hidden beneath her seat. But now let's pivot slightly. You're no longer just the silent observer in the choir stall. You're following the chisel marks backward, tracing the shapes the wood takes, and wondering about the hands that made them. Who were these carvers? And perhaps more importantly, why did they choose to depict scenes of drunken revelers, fighting animals, strange hybrid creatures, and yes, occasionally explicit acts in a church? This is where the story moves from the potentially private world of the nun to the broader, messier, often contradictory public world of medieval life. The carvers were not typically members of the religious community themselves. They were lay craftsmen, skilled artisans who belonged to guilds. They were hired to furnish the church just like the stonemasons who built the walls, the glaziers who made the windows, or the painters who decorated the altars. These were men and very occasionally women, but woodcarving was heavily male-dominated, who lived in the bustling, sometimes chaotic towns and cities, not the quiet contemplation of the cloister. They experienced the full spectrum of medieval life, the markets, the taverns, the festivals, the social hierarchies, the struggles, and the sins. Think about their environment. They weren't working in sterile, quiet workshops separate from the world. They might have had workshops attached to the church construction site itself, or perhaps worked in their own premises in town, bringing the finished pieces to the church for installation. While working, they would be interacting with other lay workmen, possibly members of the local community, and perhaps even occasionally with the clergy or nuns overseeing the project. Their minds were filled with the sights, sounds, and stories of their everyday existence, not solely with sacred scripture and liturgy. So, when they were given the commission to carve misericords, what were their instructions? We don't have detailed contracts for every carving project, but it's unlikely the instructions were incredibly specific about the subject matter for these hidden, functional supports. The focus would have been on the quality of the carving, the structural integrity, and perhaps the overall style. The carvers likely had a significant degree of creative freedom, especially for the underside carvings that weren't prominently displayed. It was a chance, perhaps, to flex their skills, express their views, or simply depict subjects they knew well from their own lives. Why choose secular or profane subjects? Several theories exist, and it's probable that a combination of factors was at play, rather than one single explanation for all carvings across all churches and centuries. One common theory is that these secular carvings served as a kind of visual release valve, or counterpoint to the intense sacredness of the main church space. The main altars, the stained glass, the statues, the wall paintings, these were all overwhelmingly religious, depicting saints, biblical scenes, or Christ's passion in divine majesty. The misericords, hidden beneath the seats, offered a space for the mundane, the human, even the slightly irreverent. It's like the medieval equivalent of doodling during a serious lecture, a way to acknowledge the everyday while the main event is focused on the sublime. This concept is sometimes framed as the world turned upside down theme. Medieval art and literature often played with inversions of the social order or expected norm. Peasants acting like nobles, animals behaving like humans, serious things treated humorously. The misericords, being underneath the seats, were literally under the sacred space occupied by the clergy or choir. Filling this underspace with images of the everyday, the foolish, or the earthy could be seen as a deliberate contrast, a playful or even subversive commentary on the world outside the church walls. You sit above, contemplating the divine, Below you is the messy reality you left behind, or perhaps the temptations you strive to overcome. Another angle is that these carvings were simply a reflection of medieval popular culture. Many of the scenes depicted are straight out of folklore, proverbs, fables, like Aesop's, allegories, or even just observations of daily life. Think about the prevalence of animal combat scenes, lions fighting dragons, monkeys fighting rabbits. These often carried symbolic meanings, good versus evil, virtues versus vices, but they were also just exciting images. Scenes of domestic life, tradesmen working, musicians playing, people dancing. These were the bread and butter of medieval existence. The carvers were, in a sense, documenting the world they inhabited, creating a visual record of medieval social life, its customs, its amusements, and its struggles. Historians still argue whether the frequency of certain secular themes, like scenes of daily life or proverbs illustrated, indicates a conscious effort by the carvers to create a mirror of society, or if it was simply the most readily available subject matter drawn from oral tradition and common knowledge. Were they trying to instruct or reflect? It's hard to say definitively without the carver's own accounts, which are non-existent. Then there's the element of social commentary and satire. Medieval society was rigidly hierarchical, but that didn't stop people from criticizing it, often through humor or allegory. Images of clergy acting foolishly, monks behaving badly, often depicted as foxes or wolves in habits, or peasants outsmarting authority figures were common in medieval art, including misericords. The famous image of a fox dressed as a bishop preaching to geese, who are often being eaten by other foxes, is a clear satire on corrupt clergy leading their flock astray. Such carvings allowed for a subtle, perhaps deniable form of critique within the very institution being criticized. It's like drawing a caricature of your boss on a sticky note and hiding it under your desk. And what about the overtly profane or erotic images? These are less common than the secular or satirical ones, but they exist and are often the most perplexing to modern viewers. Again, there are various interpretations. They could be warnings against sin, particularly lust, serving as visual reminders of the temptations of the flesh that both clergy and lay people were urged to resist. In an era where sermons and moral tales were often graphic in their descriptions of sin and its consequences, a carving depicting sexual activity might have been intended as a shocking visual aid, a memento mori of the soul's potential damnation. It's a bit like those medieval paintings of grotesque demons dragging sinners to hell, meant to inspire fear and encourage piety, albeit through a mechanism that feels heavy-handed to us. Alternatively, some scholars suggest that even potentially erotic imagery might have had symbolic meanings lost to us today. Medieval symbolism was complex and multi-layered. An image that appears purely sexual to us might have represented something entirely different within their symbolic language, perhaps related to fertility, a concern in a largely agrarian society, or spiritual union, though this is a stretch for many of the images, or even a reflection of pagan survivals or folk beliefs integrated into Christian culture. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval churches were not exclusively sacred spaces in the way we often think of them today. While the altar and chancel were strictly for religious functions, the nave was often a community hub. People met there, merchants sometimes conducted business, travelers slept there, and even legal proceedings occasionally took place within the church building or its grounds. This blending of sacred and secular functions in the physical space might have made the inclusion of secular and even profane imagery less jarring to medieval sensibilities than it is to ours. The church building housed the sacred, but it also housed the community, and the community's life was not solely focused on prayer. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some very fringe theories suggest that some of the more bizarre or erotic misericord carvings might relate to pre-Christian pagan fertility rites or folk beliefs that persisted beneath the surface of official Christianity. Images of grotesque figures with exaggerated features, figures displaying their genitals, or strange hybrid creatures could, in this interpretation, be distant echoes of ancient symbols related to fertility, protection, or warding off evil. Historians still argue whether seemingly pagan or folk motifs in church art represent genuine survivals of pre-Christian beliefs, or if they were simply incorporated as decorative elements, their original meaning lost or transformed. One, it's a difficult question to answer definitively, but the sheer strangeness of some carvings certainly opens the door to such speculation. Consider also the possibility that some of these carvings were simply inside jokes among the carvers or the local community. A carving of a specific villager known for a particular eccentricity or a depiction of a local event, like a bad harvest represented by struggling peasants, or even a visual pun. Without knowing the specific local context of each church, these meanings are almost impossible to recover, but they would explain why some carvings seem so specific and peculiar. The carvers themselves were often highly skilled, but also likely part of the working class. They might have seen the church as a workplace, and while respecting the sacred nature of the project, also felt a certain freedom to express their own worldviews, which included humor, satire, and an acknowledgement of the earthy realities of life. They weren't theologians, they were artisans who spent their days working with wood, translating ideas, their own or others, into physical form. Think of the sheer volume of carving required for choir stalls in a large church. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of individual pieces. After carving numerous saints and foliage patterns, perhaps the carvers found relief and enjoyment in depicting something different, something from their own experiences. It was a creative outlet, a chance to carve a scene they found amusing or meaningful, a break from the repetitive sacred iconography. The placement of these carvings, beneath the folding seats and often partially obscured, is key. It allowed for subject matter that might not have been considered appropriate for more visible parts of the church. It was a semi-private space within a public building, a space where the rules of appropriate religious imagery were perhaps less strictly applied or policed. The client, the church, or the patron might have approved the overall design but paid less attention to the specific details of the hidden carvings, giving the carvers carte blanche within certain broad parameters. Ultimately, the motivations behind these varied and often baffling misericord carvings were likely a complex mix of factors: a desire to contrast the sacred with the secular, a reflection of medieval popular culture and folklore, a vehicle for social commentary and satire, a potential warning against sin, possible echoes of older beliefs, inside jokes, and simply the creative expression of the artisans themselves. They offer a fascinating glimpse into the minds of the people who built and furnished these magnificent buildings, reminding us that even within the confines of religious art, the human desire for humor, observation, and even a touch of irreverence found a way to express itself, hidden away, waiting to be discovered centuries later. You look down again at the carving under the seat, seeing it not just as a peculiar image, but as a tiny window into the bustling, complex world of the medieval carver. You've walked the streets with the carver, seen the bustling, sometimes chaotic world that filled his mind and his chisel strokes. You've felt the wood chips fly and heard the hammer tap against the gouge, understanding a little more about why those strange earthly scenes ended up hidden beneath a choir seat. But now you return to the quiet, resonant space of the church choir itself. You are the nun again, or perhaps just observing her settling onto the polished wood of the stall, preparing for another long hour of standing and prayer. And as you shift your weight, seeking that brief, essential support, your eye is drawn, as it must be, to the small, carved image tucked away beneath the hinged seat. This is no fleeting glance. This is the view you have, multiple times a day, every day, year after year, perhaps even for a lifetime. You are not an art critic in a gallery, studying the piece under optimal light. You are tired, focused on the liturgy, perhaps cold, perhaps hungry, perhaps wrestling with your own thoughts and distractions. The carving beneath you is simply there, part of the furniture, a known quantity in the familiar landscape of your daily devotion. But familiarity doesn't always breed contempt. Sometimes it allows for slow, deep contemplation, or perhaps just a persistent, low-level curiosity. Think about the rhythm of monastic life. It's structured around the divine office, the series of prayers sung or recited at specific hours throughout the day and night, matins when it's still dark, lauds as dawn breaks, prime terce, sext, none during the day, vespers as evening falls, and compline before sleep. For much of this, you are standing. And the misericord, the mercy seat, is your salvation during the longest stretches. You lean, rest your weight on the small ledge, taking pressure off your aching feet and weary legs. And there, right at eye level, or just below, depending on your posture, is the carving. You might try to ignore it at first. Focus on the psalms, the hymns, the readings. Keep your eyes forward towards the altar. But the image is persistent. Maybe it's a grotesquely grinning face. Maybe it's two animals fighting. Maybe it's something even more unexpected. Over time, it becomes impossible not to see it, not to acknowledge its presence. How do you process this? You, whose life is dedicated to God, to prayer, to escaping the snares of the world. You who have forsworn worldly pleasures, possessions, and often worldly relationships. And here, beneath your seat of prayer, is a vivid snapshot of that very world you are trying to transcend. Drunken peasants, lewd figures, violent scenes, foolish characters. Your reaction might depend on who you are. Are you young and new to the convent, still fresh from the outside world? And do you perhaps feel a pang of recognition or even illicit amusement? Do you quickly look away, scandalized, and whisper a prayer for purity of thought? Or are you an older nun, perhaps the prioress, weathered and wise, who has seen much and understands the complexities of human nature, finding perhaps a different kind of meaning in the images? Maybe, just maybe, these carvings become a peculiar aid to contemplation, albeit in an unconventional way. Instead of focusing on an image of a saint to inspire virtue, you look at the depiction of a vice, gluttony, wrath, lust, and it serves as a reminder of what you are striving against. The image of the drunken reveler makes you appreciate sobriety and discipline. The fighting animals remind you of the need for peace and charity within the community. The foolish figures underscore the importance of spiritual wisdom. It's the flip side of the coin, a negative image that highlights the positive virtues by contrast. Or perhaps, in the long, quiet hours of prayer, your mind wanders. Despite your best efforts, thoughts of home, of family, of the life you left behind can intrude. And these carvings depicting scenes of everyday life, a farmer plowing, a merchant haggling, musicians playing, might connect you in a small, contained way back to that world. They are miniature portals to the secular realm, reminders of the people you pray for, the society from which your community draws its sustenance and new members. They might even humanize the challenges and temptations faced by those outside the cloister, fostering a sense of compassion. Historians still argue whether medieval nuns were generally encouraged to interpret religious or secular art allegorically on their own, or if they primarily relied on interpretations provided by their confessors or chaplains. Did they actively seek deeper meaning in the carvings, or were they simply passive viewers? Their level of education varied greatly depending on the convent's wealth and the family background of the nuns. Some convents were centers of learning where nuns copied manuscripts and read widely, potentially giving them the tools to understand complex symbolism or satire. Others might have been less focused on intellectual pursuits. A mainstream historical fact is that while monastic life was centered on prayer, it also involved significant amounts of manual labor and administrative tasks necessary for the community's survival. Nuns worked in gardens, managed estates, ran schools or infirmaries, copied texts, and produced crafts like embroidery. Their minds were not solely occupied with abstract theology, they were also engaged with the practical realities of the world, albeit within the convent walls. This practical engagement might have made images of secular life more relatable and less purely alien or shocking. Consider a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some medieval convents were known for their artistic output, particularly in illuminated manuscripts and textiles. While the misericord carvings themselves were usually done by laymen, the nuns might have been involved in the patronage or specification of some elements of the church's decoration. Could a prioress, perhaps with a dry sense of humor or a specific message she wanted to subtly convey, have had input into the carving subjects, even the hidden ones? It's a fringe idea, hard to prove, but it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility that a strong-willed abbess might have suggested a theme or two that resonated with her community's internal life or her views on the outside world. Perhaps that carving of two cats fighting viciously under Sister Benedicta's seat wasn't random. You spend hours kneeling during certain parts of the service, then rise and stand, leaning back on the misericord. Your eyes trace the lines of the carving. You've seen it so many times, you could probably reproduce it from memory. You notice details you never saw before. The way the carver captured the tension in a fighting animal's muscle, the slightly mournful look in a fool's eye, the exaggerated gesture of a dancer. You start to see the skill, the artistry, independent of the subject matter. Maybe there's a hint of quiet rebellion in the viewing. Society outside expects nuns to be ethereal beings, untouched by worldly concerns. But you are human. You have memories, thoughts, feelings that aren't always strictly devotional. Seeing these carvings, sometimes funny, sometimes crude, sometimes simply depicting the everyday struggles of the world, acknowledges that humanity, that connection to the broader sweep of life that you have technically left behind but can never entirely erase from your mind or heart. It's a secret world under your seat, a shared understanding perhaps among the nuns who use those specific stalls, a silent commentary on the solemnity above. Imagine the giggle suppressed during a particularly long sermon when your eye catches the carving of a monkey pulling a face, or the moment of quiet reflection prompted by a carving of a beggar, reminding you to pray for the poor outside the convent walls. Or perhaps, seeing an image of a couple embracing, you offer a prayer for the sanctity of marriage. Or perhaps, if you are very honest with yourself in the privacy of your thoughts, you wrestle with your own renunciation of such a connection. The context is everything. These carvings weren't just random images. They were embedded in the physical space of prayer, viewed during acts of profound spiritual significance. Their meaning for the viewer, the nun, would have been filtered through her vows, her daily discipline, her understanding of scripture and theology, and her personal experiences. A carving of a fox preaching to geese, easily understood as satire on corrupt clergy, might have resonated deeply in a convent that felt it was being unfairly treated by local church authorities, or perhaps simply served as a universal reminder of the dangers of hypocrisy. The sheer repetition is key. You might look at the carving differently depending on your mood, or the season, or the specific service being performed. On a way when community harmony feels strained, the fighting animals might seem like a direct commentary. During a festival, a carving of musicians might bring a sense of shared joy, even in recollection. During Lent, a depiction of hardship might underscore the theme of penitence. The carvings were static, but their meaning could be dynamic, shifting with the viewer's internal state and the liturgical context. It's possible, too, that these carvings were not always interpreted individually, but as part of a larger, sometimes thematic program across all the stalls in the choir. While the overall scheme might seem random to us, medieval thought often found connections and patterns in seemingly disparate images. Perhaps a sequence of carvings told a story, a fable, a morality tale, or illustrated a series of proverbs, or depicted the stages of life, or the different sins. The nun using her stall daily might have understood her specific carving as just one piece of a larger visual puzzle, adding layers to its meaning. But even if there was an overarching theme, the personal, intimate nature of the interaction remains. This is your seat. This is your carving. No one else kneels or sits quite where you do. It is your own private piece of art, or commentary, or distraction, or aid to reflection in the midst of a communal act of worship. It's a small corner of individuality within a life structured by strict community rules and shared practices. Maybe the most common reaction was simply indifference. After seeing the same carving hundreds, thousands of times, perhaps it just faded into the background, becoming no more remarkable than the pattern of the floor tiles or the texture of the stone columns. It was just there, a functional support, its image so familiar as to be invisible. Like the pictures on your living room wall that you no longer truly see after years of living with them. But even in indifference, there's a subtle acknowledgement. The carving is part of the environment. It contributes, however subtly, to the overall atmosphere of the choir. It's a reminder that even in the most sacred spaces, the human world, with its follies, its struggles, its humor, and its occasional beauty, is never entirely absent. It's literally the foundation you rest upon as you reach towards the divine. You lean back again, the pressure easing from your knees and feet. Your eyes drift down to the carving. A strange creature, half human, half beast, stares back with wide, wooden eyes. You wonder for the thousandth time what it's supposed to mean. A demon? A representation of inner struggle? Just the carver being weird? The meaning remains elusive, hidden not just by the seat above it, but by the centuries that separate your world from the world of the nun who sat here before you. But the connection is real, a shared moment across time, centered on this small, strange piece of carved wood. You've sat there, leaned there, knelt there, your eyes tracing the lines of the small, often baffling carving beneath your seat. You've imagined the carver, the world outside, even the potential thoughts of the nun who might have used this very spot centuries ago. But now let's zoom out a bit, shifting from the personal experience to the broader question that has perplexed scholars for generations. Why were these images put here, in this most sacred part of the church? What was their purpose? This isn't just idle curiosity from tweed-clad academics. The sheer volume and variety of these carvings, sometimes innocent, sometimes bizarre, sometimes frankly scandalous, demand an explanation. They cost money to produce. They were placed in positions where members of the clergy or the monastic community would see them daily. They weren't hidden in a broom closet. They were integral, if discreet, parts of the choir stalls. So what message, if any, were they meant to convey? One of the most prominent theories, and one that seems plausible given the context of a religious setting, is that these carvings served a moral or allegorical purpose. In a world where literacy was far less widespread than today, and even for those who could read, visual aids were incredibly powerful tools for teaching, reminding, and reinforcing important concepts, especially spiritual ones. Think about it. Your life within the convent walls is one of constant spiritual striving. You are battling temptation, trying to cultivate virtues, and seeking salvation. The world outside is seen often as a source of distraction, sin, and corruption. What better way to remind yourself and your fellow sisters of these challenges and goals than through visual metaphors, right there where you spend hours praying and contemplating? According to this theory, even the most seemingly inappropriate carvings could be interpreted in a way that served a didactic or teaching function. That carving of drunken revelers? It's not an endorsement of partying. It's a stark warning against the sin of gluttony and the dangers of earthly pleasure leading one astray from the spiritual path. The image of two animals fighting viciously? A clear illustration of wrath, discord, and the lack of charity, reminding you of the importance of peace and harmony within the cloister. Even carvings that depicted ordinary secular life could be given a moral twist. A merchant weighing goods could be a reminder to be honest and just in all dealings, even mundane ones. A peasant struggling with a heavy load might symbolize the burdens of sin, or perhaps the virtue of perseverance in the face of hardship. Images of foolish figures, often depicted with exaggerated features or engaged in nonsensical activities, were classic representations of folly. Not just silliness, but spiritual folly, the rejection of divine wisdom in favor of earthly pursuits. Seeing a fool constantly might remind you to seek true wisdom, which in the medieval Christian worldview was found in God. This interpretation aligns well with the strong tradition of exempla in medieval preaching and literature. Exempla were short stories, fables, or anecdotes used to illustrate a moral point, often drawn from everyday life or animal behavior. Preachers would use these tales to make abstract theological concepts relatable and memorable for their congregations. The carvings on the misericords could be seen as visual exempla, condensed into a single image, meant to spark a similar chain of thought in the viewer's mind. Ah, fighting dogs. That's like anger. I must strive for patience. It's like getting a tiny, silent sermon carved into your furniture. Handy, right? Especially during a particularly long litany. Historians still argue whether the moral interpretations of these carvings were universally understood and intentional on the part of the patrons or carvers, or if they were interpretations applied by later generations seeking to impose order on what seems chaotic. Was there a codified list of what each image meant, or was it more open to personal interpretation, perhaps guided by general medieval allegorical thinking? It's tough to say for sure, as we don't often have written records explicitly stating, and we put the monkey there to remind Sister Agnes not to be so frivolous. Though honestly, I wouldn't put it past them to have wanted to write that down somewhere. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Allegory was a fundamental mode of thought and interpretation in the Middle Ages, particularly within religious contexts. Biblical texts, nature, everyday objects, and human actions were frequently understood to have multiple layers of meaning: literal, allegorical, symbolizing truths of faith; tropological, moral lessons for conduct; and anagogical, pointing towards ultimate destiny or heavenly things. Given this widespread practice, it's entirely plausible that even seemingly secular or crude images on misericords were viewed through an allegorical lens by the religious who saw them daily. A goat, for example, might not just be a goat. It could represent lechery. A lion could be Christ or the devil, depending on its context and how it was depicted. Ambiguity wasn't always seen as a problem. Sometimes it was part of the richness of the symbolism. For the nuns, whose lives were governed by the Benedictine rule or similar guidelines emphasizing humility, obedience, poverty, chastity, and stability, these visual reminders of virtues and vices could have been genuinely useful tools for self-examination and spiritual discipline. As you sat there, leaning, maybe your mind started to wander from the prayer. Your eyes fall on a carving of someone overindulging at a feast. Snap. Back to the importance of fasting and moderation. See a depiction of gossip or malice? Remember your vow of silence at certain times and the importance of building up, not tearing down, your community. It's passive-aggressive furniture design, basically. Here, have a comfy seat, but don't forget you're a sinner. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this theory is the sheer specificity of some of the allegorical interpretations found in medieval bestiaries, books describing real and mythical animals, and other symbolic texts. For example, the pelican was often depicted as a symbol of Christ because it was believed to wound itself to feed its young with its own blood. A carving of a pelican feeding its young on a misericord would be a straightforward, if perhaps emotionally intense, visual reminder of Christ's sacrifice. Less straightforward are things like the beaver castrating itself to escape hunters, symbolizing giving up earthly goods to escape the snares of the devil, or the ant storing grain, symbolizing diligence and preparing for the future. While not all misericord images are this obscure, the existence of such detailed and sometimes bizarre allegories shows how fertile the medieval mind was in finding spiritual meaning in the natural world and human activities. Could some carvings be visual references to these less common symbols, understandable to someone educated in such lore within the convent? It's a fascinating, if speculative, thought. So you are sitting or leaning on your misericord. You see, say, a carving of a woman beating her husband. On the surface, domestic violence, perhaps even humorous in a dark medieval way. But through an allegorical lens, it could represent the feminine quality of the flesh dominating the masculine spirit, a classic interpretation of the struggle against carnal desires. Or it could simply be a warning against the sin of anger within marriage, applicable metaphorically to the marriage between the soul and God or Christ and the church. The possibilities for interpretation were vast, sometimes perhaps stretching the original intent to its breaking point, but still serving a moral end. The question arises, for whom were these moral lessons intended? Primarily for the religious community, the monks, canons, or nuns who occupied the choir stalls daily. They were the main audience, constantly exposed to these visual cues. However, in many churches and cathedrals, parts of the choir might also be visible to lay people attending services or during processions. Were the carvings meant to teach them too? Probably less directly. The nuances of monastic allegory might have been lost on a peasant farmer, but even simple images like fighting animals or drunkards would convey basic moral warnings against strife and excess. One could also argue that these carvings weren't just about warning against sin, but also about illustrating Christian virtues, albeit sometimes through the negative example of their opposite. By showing folly, they underscored the importance of wisdom. By showing discord, they highlighted the value of peace. By showing struggle, they affirmed the need for perseverance. They were, in a way, illustrated guides to the spiritual life, tucked away beneath the seats of prayer. Consider the carving of a fox preaching to geese, a common image on misericords. This was a well-known medieval fable, clearly satirizing corrupt or hypocritical clergy who preyed upon their flock, the geese. For a nun, this might have been a reminder to be discerning about whom she trusted for spiritual guidance, or perhaps a commentary on the state of the wider church outside the convent walls. It's moral, yes, but also carries a punchy, satirical edge. This theory of moral instruction helps explain the presence of many carvings, including those depicting vices or follies. It fits the overall context of a religious building and the didactic nature of medieval art. It suggests that even the most perplexing images had a serious, perhaps even pious purpose behind them. They weren't just random doodles. They were carefully chosen, or at least interpreted, as part of the visual landscape of spiritual formation. However, this theory doesn't explain everything. Does it fully account for the genuinely crude or seemingly gratuitously explicit images? Does the presence of an erotic carving really serve a moral purpose, even allegorically? Perhaps as a reminder of the temptation of lust? Maybe, but it feels like a bit of a stretch for some of the more graphic examples. This is where other theories start to come into play, theories we'll explore later, suggesting different motivations behind the carvers and those who commission the work. For now, though, sit back or lean forward onto that misericord. Look at the carving again. Try, just for a moment, to see it through the eyes of someone steeped in medieval allegory. What spiritual truth, what moral warning, what reminder of virtue or vice could this image possibly represent? Is that fighting creature a symbol of internal struggle? Is that leering face a representation of temptation? Is that seemingly simple scene of daily life a complex metaphor for the soul's journey? It's a puzzle, a silent question posed across the centuries by the carver to the sitter, and maybe, just maybe, they hoped the answer would lead you closer to holiness, or at least keep you awake during matins. So, you've considered the idea that maybe, just maybe, those bizarre little carvings beneath your seat were meant to be moral lessons, silent sermons in wood, guiding you towards virtue and away from sin. And yes, for many images, that interpretation feels right, fitting neatly into the highly allegorical and didactic world of medieval religious life. But what about the carvings that just don't quite fit? The ones that seem, well, funny, or just plain weird. The ones that depict scenes of everyday life, sometimes crude, sometimes comical, sometimes seemingly pointless, right there in the heart of the most sacred space. This is where another major strand of scholarly thought steps in, suggesting that while moral allegory was certainly a purpose for which some carvings, it wasn't the only one. Perhaps, this theory posits, these carvings weren't always reaching for the heavens. Sometimes they were firmly rooted in the earth, reflecting the secular world outside the cloister walls, offering commentary, satire, or simply providing a bit of visual interest and even, dare we say, entertainment. Imagine living your life within the strictly ordered, often austere confines of a convent or monastery. Your days are governed by the bell, punctuated by prayer, work, silence, and communal meals. The outside world, with all its chaos, color, trauma, noise, and sheer human messiness, is largely shut out. But the people carving these stalls, they likely weren't monks or nuns themselves. They were lay craftsmen, coming in from the towns and villages, bringing with them stories, observations, and perhaps a less purely spiritual perspective on life. And the wood itself, it was probably carved outside the cloister and brought in. So what if some of these carvings were simply a reflection of the world these craftsmen inhabited, or the world that the religious community knew, however distantly, still existed? You find carvings of peasants going about their tasks, plowing fields, milking cows, harvesting crops. You see merchants counting money or interacting with customers. There are depictions of craftsmen at work, a shoemaker, a carpenter, a blacksmith. These aren't necessarily allegorical figures of labor or commerce as virtues or vices. They just look like people doing their jobs. Why include this secular imagery? Perhaps it was a reminder of the world from which many of the religious came, or the world that supported the monastery through tithes and donations. Perhaps it was a way to acknowledge the fundamental human activities that sustain society. And or maybe, just maybe, the carvers simply depicted what they knew, what they saw every day, filling the space with familiar scenes. It's the medieval equivalent of putting up pictures of cats on the office wall. Sometimes it's just decoration that resonates. Except instead of cats, you get a guy wrestling a pig, standard. But beyond mere depiction of daily life, many carvings seem to lean heavily into humor, satire, and the grotesque. Think about the images you might have seen. A figure with a comically oversized head, or a grotesque mask-like face contorted in an exaggerated expression. Animals behaving like humans, a monkey riding a goat, birds pulling a cart, a rabbit cooking a hunter. Scenes of pure absurdity, people fighting with household objects, strange hybrid creatures, scatological humor that would make a modern teenager blush. This aligns with a mainstream historical fact. Medieval culture, particularly popular culture and feast days, had a strong tradition of humor, burlesque, and world upside-down imagery. The Feast of Fools, for instance, was a medieval festival where the social order was temporarily inverted, minor clerics would impersonate bishops, and general revelry and satire of authority figures were common. It was a sanctioned release valve for social tensions. While misericords aren't exactly the Feast of Fools, the spirit of playful subversion and poking fun seems to echo in many of the carvings. Seeing a carving of, say, a group of drunkards tumbling over each other might indeed be a moral warning against gluttony, as the previous theory suggested, but it could also just be seen as funny. Slapstick comedy is timeless, right? Imagine being a nun or monk, sitting through hours of silent prayer, your leg going numb, and your eyes drift down to a carving of some poor soul falling off a donkey head first. A little internal chuckle might break the monotony. It's like finding a hidden doodle in your school textbook during a boring lecture. Instant, quiet amusement. Many carvings seem to satirize various groups or aspects of medieval life. Lawyers were often depicted as greedy figures, literally swallowing up property. Doctors were shown as incompetent or even dangerous. Figures of authority, both secular and sometimes religious, could be subtly mocked through animal fables or exaggerated depictions of their flaws. The fox preaching to the geese we mentioned? Definitely moral, yes, but also sharp social satire aimed at hypocritical clergy. This isn't just about being funny, though. Satire, even gentle satire, serves a purpose. It can be a way of commenting on social injustices, highlighting human folly, or offering a critique of accepted norms, even within the relatively closed world of the monastery or convent. While the religious might have renounced the world, they weren't entirely oblivious to its ways, nor were they immune to finding humor in its imperfections. And what about the sheer weirdness? The strange hybrids, the bizarre, unclassifiable creatures, the seemingly random juxtapositions of images. Some scholars propose that these represent the medieval fascination with the marginal, the monstrous, and the edge of the known world. In a time before mass media, where knowledge was often fragmented and belief in mythical creatures and strange phenomena was widespread, depicting such things wasn't necessarily symbolic. It might simply be an expression of curiosity or unease about the unknown. Or more simply, the carver just thought a guy with a snake coming out of his ear looked cool. Hard to say, centuries later. The idea of these carvings serving as a kind of release valve is also compelling. Monastic life, particularly in stricter orders, demanded immense discipline, self-denial, and control over one's emotions and thoughts. While this was undertaken voluntarily for spiritual reasons, the psychological pressure could be immense. A moment of visual levity, a chance to see the world turned upside down in miniature, or a reminder of the messy, uncontrolled world outside, might have offered a small, harmless outlet for tension. It's like stress relief art you sit on. A quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to the sheer inventiveness of some of these carvings. While certain motifs repeat across different churches, there's also an incredible amount of unique imagery. Some misericords feature visual puns, medieval proverbs rendered visually, or even illustrations of obscure folk tales that are now lost to us. It's as if the carvers had a whole library of visual gags and cultural references they could draw upon, and they weren't afraid to get specific, assuming their audience, the monks, nuns, or perhaps each other, would get the joke or the reference. This level of specificity, sometimes tied to local folklore or guilds, suggests these weren't just generic moral symbols, but were connected to the lived experience and cultural knowledge of the time and place. Historians still argue whether the primary impulse behind the secular and humorous carvings was purely entertainment, social commentary aimed at a specific audience, or an unconscious expression of the carver's own worldview brought into the sacred space. Was the intent to make the religious laugh during a long service? Was it a subtle form of critique allowed in a space where overt protest was impossible? Or were the carvers simply given creative license within certain bounds? And this is what emerged from their minds and hands. We often lack written evidence of commissioning briefs or the carver's intentions, leaving us to interpret based on the images themselves and our understanding of medieval culture. This interpretation also helps us explain the more genuinely crude or even erotic images that struggle to find a convincing moral allegory. Perhaps some were intended as warnings against lust, yes, but others might have simply been reflections of a bawdier element in medieval secular culture, brought into the church by the carvers. Medieval humor wasn't always subtle or refined, and what seems shocking to us today might have been seen as par for the course, or even amusing by some people then. It's uncomfortable to think about, especially in a church, but denying that element of medieval culture exists doesn't help us understand the carvings. Think about the image again, the one beneath your hand as you lean. Does the secular humor/satirical theory fit? Is it a depiction of someone from everyday life, perhaps exaggerated for comic effect? Is it an animal doing something ridiculous, a subtle poke at human behavior? Is it just plain odd, reflecting a medieval love for the grotesque or the margins? Maybe it's not trying to teach you anything spiritual at all. Maybe it's just trying to make you smile, or raise an eyebrow, or wonder what on earth was going on in the mind of the person who carved it. This perspective shifts the focus from the intended recipient of a moral lesson, the religious person sitting there, to the creator and their connection to the wider world. It suggests that the choir stalls weren't just spaces for prayer and contemplation, but also canvases that absorbed elements of the vibrant, sometimes chaotic, and often humorous medieval world outside. They were spaces where the sacred met the secular, sometimes in surprising and unsettling ways. Whether it was a visual depiction of a popular fable, a caricature of a well-known character type, or simply a moment of creative whimsy from the carver, these images offer a glimpse into the non-pious aspects of medieval life and thought. They remind us that even in the most devout settings, human beings are complex creatures, capable of seeing the humor, the absurdity, and the everyday reality of the world around them, and finding ways to express it, even if it's tucked away under a seat. It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? That beneath the weight of piety and tradition, there was room for a bit of a laugh or a raised eyebrow or a silent recognition of the messy, wonderful, ridiculous world outside the cloister door. And as you shift your weight on the misericord, you can almost feel the echo of that medieval chuckle. Or maybe that's just your knee cracking. Either way. So you've been sitting there, perhaps shifting your weight, considering the possibilities, moral lessons carved into the wood, or perhaps something less pious, maybe even something humorous, reflecting the messy, vibrant, ridiculous world outside the cloister walls. You've considered the possibility that the carvers were just having a bit of a visual chuckle, or offering a sly commentary on medieval life, or simply depicting the everyday world they knew. But then you remember the images that push the boundaries even further. The ones that aren't just funny or secular, but are explicitly, undeniably sexually suggestive, sometimes even overtly erotic. These are the carvings that make people, historians, clergy, tourists, pause. They are the ones that seem, on the surface, the most profoundly out of place in the sacred context of a church choir stall, a space dedicated to prayer, contemplation, and divine service. If the goal was purely moral instruction or harmless secular commentary, why these images? Why figures engaged in sexual acts, or displaying exaggerated genitalia, or depicted in compromising or sexually charged situations? The easy answer, and one that fits neatly into the moral allegory theory, is that these were meant as stark warnings against the sin of lust. In medieval Christian thought, lust was one of the 7 deadly sins, a powerful and dangerous force that could lead a soul to damnation. Depicting the act could be seen as a vivid reminder of its sinful nature and its potential consequences. Imagine a monk or nun wrestling with temptation, lowering their seat, and being confronted with a graphic image of the very sin they are trying to resist. It could be intended as a shock, a visceral reminder of what was at stake. And certainly there are carvings that can plausibly be interpreted this way. Images that show couples engaged in sexual activity, sometimes accompanied by demonic figures or other symbols of sin and damnation, seem clearly designed to illustrate the perils of carnal desire. A figure being punished for lust might be depicted alongside the act itself. This interpretation aligns with the didactic function many medieval images served, reminding the faithful of the moral landscape, the virtues to pursue, and the vices to shun. Medieval sermons, after all, weren't always subtle, and visual aids could be equally blunt. However, this explanation often feels insufficient when faced with the sheer variety and sometimes the apparent lack of explicit moral context surrounding other sexually suggestive images. Not all of them are accompanied by devils or signs of punishment. Some seem almost celebratory or simply matter of fact. Others are frankly bizarre, mixing sexuality with grotesque elements or animal forms in ways that defy simple interpretation as a straightforward, "don't do this" message. This leads scholars down other, often more complex, interpretive paths. One theory suggests that these carvings might function less as a public sermon and more as a kind of private, internal confessional aid. Medieval confession was a structured process where individuals were encouraged to examine their conscience and detail their sins. For clergy and monastics, sins of the flesh, even in thought, were a constant spiritual battlefield. Could these images serve as visual prompts, reminding the individual of specific temptations or past failings to be confessed? It's like a medieval visual checklist of things you definitely shouldn't be doing, helpfully placed right where you can see it while you're supposed to be contemplating higher things. Oh, right, that. Better add that to the list for Father Michael. A mainstream historical fact that underpins this is the intense focus on personal sin and the practice of detailed confession in medieval religious life. Manuals for confessors and guides for self-examination were widely used. The idea that visual stimuli could be incorporated into this penitential practice isn't far-fetched. Churches were filled with images designed to provoke specific emotional or spiritual responses, from tears of repentance before a crucifix to awe before a depiction of heaven. Why not use images to provoke recognition of sin? But even the confessional aid theory struggles with some of the weirder examples. What about images of hybrid creatures engaged in sexual acts, or humans with animal heads, or scenes that seem to combine sex with violence or humiliation in ways that are hard to neatly categorize as simple lust? This is where the world upside down or symbolic inversion theories gain traction again. Just as satirical carvings might invert social order, perhaps erotic carvings invert spiritual or bodily order. Uncontrolled sexuality could symbolize the chaotic, disordered nature of the world or the flesh when divorced from divine control. It represents the antithesis of monastic discipline, the ultimate lack of control over one's base desires. Seen in this light, the shocking nature of the image becomes its very point, a stark contrast to the ordered, celibate life being lived above it. Think of it as a visual representation of everything the monastic life was trying to suppress or transcend. The physical, messy, unruly demands of the body placed symbolically under the seat, beneath the person striving for spiritual purity and order. It's a constant reminder of the beast beneath the habit or beneath the surface of disciplined prayer. Another intriguing, though perhaps more fringe, interpretation touches on the idea of apotropic magic, the belief that depicting evil or undesirable forces can help ward them off. Gargoyles, for instance, are often seen as apotropic, frightening away demons from the sacred space. Could these carvings, by explicitly depicting the power and danger of lust, somehow neutralize or contain its influence within the sacred space? It's a less common idea, perhaps, particularly for something as internal as a sin like lust, but medieval beliefs about symbols and their power could be fluid. A quirky or fringe tidbit might be that some folk beliefs held that depicting a sickness or a bad omen could somehow discharge its power or make it less likely to occur in reality. Applying this to sexual imagery in a sacred context is debated, but it offers a different lens than purely didactic or symbolic ones. Could these images function as a visual exorcism of temptation, placed under the seat to be literally suppressed or sat upon? Then there's the persistent question of the carvers themselves. As mentioned, these were often lay craftsmen, not monks or nuns. They came from a society that, while religious, also had a robust, sometimes bawdy folk culture. They were skilled artisans, likely given some degree of latitude within a commission. Is it possible that some of these images are simply a reflection of the carver's own culture, their sense of humor, or even their personal preoccupations inserted into the work? Perhaps they were told carve some stuff related to human life and sin, and they interpreted that instruction through their own secular lens, which included a more open, or at least less inhibited view of sexuality than might be officially sanctioned by the church hierarchy. Consider the dynamic: a lay craftsman working in a church but perhaps not deeply embedded in the monastic spiritual struggle against lust. He might see an image of sexual activity as just another part of the human comedy, albeit one with moral implications according to the church. He might even find a certain transgressive humor in putting such images in such a sacred place, especially if the commission allowed for some creative freedom. It's a bit like finding a rude doodle on the back of a pew by a bored carpenter in a later era, but elevated to the level of skilled art. Could some of these images even relate to the guilds or workshops the carvers belonged to? While less likely for explicitly sexual themes, guild symbols or inside jokes sometimes appear in architectural carvings. Perhaps some of the weirder or hybrid erotic images were visual references only fully understood by the community of carvers. This is highly speculative, but the lack of clear documentation leaves room for such theories. Furthermore, we must consider the possibility of misinterpretation by modern eyes. Medieval symbolism was complex and layered. Nudity, for instance, didn't automatically equal erotic or lustful in the way it often does in post-Victorian Western culture. Nudity could symbolize innocence, vulnerability, the state of the soul before God, or even folly. Adam and Eve are depicted nude, but not necessarily erotically. The damned in hell are often nude to show their utter defenselessness. So some images that appear sexually suggestive to us might have carried different primary meanings then. However, many misericord carvings are explicit enough, depicting sexual acts or prominent genitalia, that misinterpretation as a non-sexual image seems unlikely for a significant portion of them. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for including overtly erotic or sexually suggestive images was primarily didactic, warning against sin, symbolic, representing disorder or temptation, apotropaic, warding off evil, or simply a reflection of the carver's own secular culture and sensibilities. The truth, as is often the case, might be a complex mix of these factors, varying from carving to carving and church to church. Some images might have been deliberately commissioned for their moral punch, while others might have slipped in through carver's license or complex local symbolic traditions that we no longer fully grasp. It's also worth noting that attitudes towards sexuality in the Middle Ages were not monolithic. While the church preached strict celibacy for clergy and contained sexuality within marriage for the laity, medieval society was also characterized by boisterous festivals, folk traditions, and a more public engagement with bodily functions and sexuality than is common today. Manuscript illuminations, marginalia, and other popular art forms often featured crude humor and sexual imagery. The choir stall carvings exist at an intersection of sacred and secular, elite and popular culture, potentially absorbing influences from both. Think about the sheer psychological impact. You are dedicating your life to spiritual purity, seated in a place of profound holiness, and right below you, hidden from casual view, but there whenever you need the support, are images that confront you with the very things you are trying to renounce. It's intense. It's perhaps a form of spiritual discipline in itself, Vasu, learning to sit with and above the temptations and disorders of the flesh, acknowledging their existence but not succumbing to them. The image becomes a reminder of the constant struggle, a visual representation of the battlefield within the soul. Maybe some of these images were even intended to provoke discussion in a controlled way among the monastic community or with their confessors. Difficult images can force confrontation with difficult topics. In a setting where open discussion of sexuality might be taboo, the carvings could serve as a silent, visual language for grappling with these aspects of human experience. As you continue to feel the wood beneath you, contemplating these challenging images and the many theories about their purpose, it underscores just how complex and sometimes contradictory medieval culture could be. It wasn't a world neatly divided into sacred and secular boxes in the way we might imagine. These misericords are a potent reminder that even in the heart of medieval piety, there was space, albeit often hidden away, for the full spectrum of human experience, including its most uncomfortable and debated aspects. Whether they were intended to shock, educate, remind, or simply reflect the world the carvers knew, these erotic carvings remain some of the most fascinating and perplexing examples of medieval art, prompting questions that historians continue to grapple with late into the night, and perhaps now prompting questions in your mind too. You're still there in that hushed, ancient space, the choir stalls around you holding centuries of silence and secrets. You have felt the wood, imagined the lives lived here, wrestled with the stark contrast between the nuns' rigorous vows and the hidden carving you glimpsed. But here's the thing, while monastic life was incredibly strict, medieval society outside those cloistered walls wasn't always the dour, perpetually pious place we sometimes imagine. In fact, it could be surprisingly earthy, vibrant, and yes, even explicitly bawdy. To understand how something like erotic imagery might end up in a church, you need to widen your view beyond the convent walls and step out into the bustling, messy, unfiltered world of the medieval town or village. Because while we tend to think of the Middle Ages as a time dominated by religious fervor and rigid moral codes, especially in the art that survives, mostly religious by its nature, there was a parallel, thriving, and much less serious visual culture happening. A culture where humor, everyday life, and yes, sex, were depicted quite openly, often with a wink and a nudge, or sometimes a downright lewd grin. Think about it. People then weren't fundamentally different from people now. They worked hard, they ate, they drank, they laughed, they cried, and they definitely, absolutely had sex. And just like today, this fundamental part of human existence found its way into their stories, their songs, and their art. It's a mainstream historical fact. Alongside the stained glass windows depicting saints and the illuminated manuscripts illustrating biblical scenes, there was a rich tradition of secular art, objects, and popular culture that wasn't afraid to show a bit of leg, or a lot more than that. You'd see this not necessarily in the grand, publicly visible places, but in the details of everyday life, or in objects intended for private enjoyment or specific secular contexts. Imagine you're wandering through a medieval market. Maybe you'd see peddlers selling cheap woodcuts or prints. These weren't destined for cathedrals. They were for homes, taverns, or simply for amusement. And some of these prints could be quite explicit, depicting sexual acts, bawdy jokes, or satirical scenes. They were the medieval equivalent of a slightly risque meme, passed around for a laugh. Consider objects like belt buckles, mirror cases, comb handles, or even pottery. Many examples survive today that feature surprisingly graphic imagery. You might find a small ivory mirror case carved with a couple embracing passionately, or a decorative box with scenes from courtly love that veer towards the explicit. These were personal items meant for use or display among a more intimate audience. They show that for many people, perhaps particularly the wealthy who could afford such luxuries, depictions of sexuality were not universally taboo in all contexts. It wasn't necessarily hidden away, it was just kept separate from the official, public face of religious devotion. Then there's the world of marginalia, those often wild, sometimes bizarre drawings found in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. While many are charming little doodles or decorative flourishes, others are incredibly strange, even grotesque, and yes, some are overtly sexual or scatological. You might find rabbits jousting, hybrid creatures engaging in questionable acts, or figures exposing themselves. These were added by scribes or illuminators, sometimes perhaps out of boredom, sometimes as commentary, sometimes maybe just because they were funny to them. They represent a space where the strict rules of the main text were relaxed and a much more unruly, less censored visual language emerged. It's like finding that one person in the office who always adds weird drawings to the whiteboard after a meeting. This indicates that there was a stream of visual culture in the Middle Ages that was entirely separate from the sacred, and it was often characterized by humor, caricature, and a frank engagement with bodily functions and sexuality. It wasn't always high art. Often it was folk art, popular art, things made for amusement rather than edification. So when you think about the carvers who made those misericords, you have to remember where they came from. They were often lay craftsmen, not monks or nuns. They lived and worked in that secular world. They might have spent their days carving saints for one commission, but their evenings perhaps in a tavern where off-color jokes were swapped or seen those bawdy prints in the market. Their visual vocabulary wasn't limited to the Bible and the lives of saints. It included the common motifs, symbols, and jokes of their time. It's entirely plausible that these carvers brought some of that everyday visual language with them into the church workshop. A common motif found on misericords, even outside the overtly erotic ones, is the green man, a face made of leaves, mythical beasts, scenes of everyday life, or proverbs depicted visually. These weren't necessarily deeply religious symbols. They were part of the broader artistic lexicon of the time. And within that lexicon, certain symbols or images had established, albeit sometimes multi-layered, meanings. The exhibition of genitalia, for example, wasn't always purely titillating. In some folk beliefs, explicit imagery, particularly of female genitalia, could be a patropic, believed to ward off evil spirits or the evil eye. Think of the Sheila na gig figures found on some medieval churches and castles, stone carvings of a female figure explicitly displaying her vulva. Their exact meaning is still debated, but one theory is that they served as protectors, startling or shaming evil away. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit, certainly, but it illustrates how explicit imagery could carry complex, sometimes even protective, connotations in the medieval mind, rather than being solely about arousal or sinfulness. Imagine a demon arriving, ready to cause mischief, and it's just stopped dead in its tracks by an ancient stone carving saying, "Nope, not today." Given this, it's possible that some of the erotic motifs on misericords weren't intended primarily to be erotic in the way we understand it, or weren't seen only that way. They could have carried layers of meaning, perhaps a reminder of the temptations of the flesh that the nuns were vowed to resist, or perhaps even a subtle nod to those older apotropaic ideas, bringing protection, albeit hidden, into the sacred space. Or maybe, just maybe, the carver thought it was a funny image and slipped it in, like the medieval equivalent of leaving a tiny rubber duck in a hidden spot at work. Historians still argue whether these secular or body motifs were included in churches due to a deliberate choice by patrons or clergy, a naive translation of common design patterns by craftsmen, or a subtle act of resistance or humor inserted by the carvers themselves. Was there a shared understanding that these hidden images served a particular, perhaps unspoken, purpose? Or were they simply part of the artistic background noise that the carvers couldn't help but reproduce, even in a sacred context? The lack of written records explaining these specific carvings leaves much open to scholarly debate and interpretation. It's tempting to project our modern sensibilities onto these carvings, seeing them solely through the lens of sexuality and piety as diametrically opposed forces. But the medieval mind often worked differently, less compartmentalized in some ways, more layered in others. Bawdy humor, religious devotion, superstition, and everyday life coexisted. The same person who knelt in prayer might minutes later tell a ribald joke. So as you sit there imagining the nun lifting her seat and seeing that hidden image, consider that the carver who created it, where he lived in a world where explicit imagery existed, where humor could be coarse, and where the sacred and the profane sometimes rub shoulders in unexpected ways. The misericord might not be just a symbol of rebellion or transgression within the convent walls. It could also be a small, carved echo of the much larger, louder, and less restrained world that lay just beyond the gates. The fact that these images survived suggests they weren't universally considered scandalous enough to be removed, at least not initially. Perhaps their hidden nature made them less problematic, or perhaps attitudes towards such imagery evolved over time. Or maybe, just maybe, people knew they were there and either didn't care or found them, dare we say, amusing in their own quiet medieval way. It challenges the idea of a monolithic, purely austere medieval church. There were cracks, literally and figuratively, where other parts of the culture seeped in. You gently lower the seat again, the wood settling back into place. The hidden image is gone once more, but your understanding of its context has broadened significantly. It's not just an anomaly in a place of piety, it's potentially a convergence point, where the strictures of religious life meet the earthy reality of medieval popular culture, mediated by the hands of a craftsman who lived in both worlds. It makes the carving less an inexplicable outlier and more a strange, fascinating product of its complex time. You've broadened your perspective now, pulling back from the intricate carving itself to see the larger, louder world of medieval life that existed beyond the convent walls. You have considered the carver, a likely layman, steeped in the earthy humor and visual traditions that included depictions of sex, whether for humor, superstition, or simply because it was part of the human experience. And you've started to reconcile the image of pious nuns with the reality that the people making their furniture lived in a different sphere. But the central question still lingers, hanging in the quiet air of this ancient space. Did the nuns who used these choir stalls, day in and day out, kneeling and standing, praying and singing, actually know about the explicit carvings hidden beneath their seats? It's a fascinating puzzle, isn't it? On the one hand, these were their seats. They spent hours here every single day, following a rigorous schedule of prayer that structured their entire lives. The daily office, as it was called, involved specific times for communal prayer throughout the day and night. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. This is a mainstream historical fact. Monastic life was dictated by the pealing of bells summoning nuns and monks to the choir for services, regardless of the hour or the weather. They would stand, sit, and kneel according to the liturgy using these very stalls. So how could they not know? Surely at some point, while standing during a lengthy psalm or maybe just shifting position, a nun might have glanced down or perhaps reached under the seat to steady herself and discovered the unexpected artwork lurking there. It seems improbable that something so visually distinct could remain unseen for decades, even centuries, especially by people whose lives revolved around this specific physical space. Yet the very nature of the carving's placement strongly suggests the intent was for it to be unseen by the primary users. These carvings aren't on the seat back, or the armrest, or the visible front panel. They are exclusively on the underside of the tip-up seat, the misericord itself. This seat is only fully visible when it is tipped up, which happens when the nun is standing during the service. When she's kneeling or fully sitting, the carving is completely concealed, hidden from view. Imagine yourself in that scenario. You are a nun in the 14th century, let's say. Your focus is on the liturgy, on the prayers, on maintaining your spiritual discipline. You are dressed in layers of habit, perhaps with a wimple restricting your peripheral vision to some extent. When you stand, you likely stand straight, facing the altar or the other side of the choir. The misericord provides a small ledge to lean on, offering pity or mercy during long periods of standing, hence the name. To see the carving, you'd have to deliberately look under the seat while it's in its upright position. Why would you do that? It's not a natural movement. You're not dusting or cleaning the underside of the seat while standing in prayer. You're not inspecting the craftsmanship for flaws. You are presumably focused on higher matters. It would require a moment of distraction, perhaps boredom during a particularly lengthy reading, or a deliberate act of curiosity, to crane your neck and peer into that hidden space. It would be like spending hours every day sitting on a train and never once looking under the seat cushion. Okay, maybe a slightly creepy analogy, but you get the point. It's not where your attention is directed. So, it's entirely plausible that for many nuns, perhaps even the majority, these carvings remain completely unknown. They lived and died using their stalls, finding support from the misericords during endless hours of prayer, without ever realizing the secret world of imagery hidden inches below their habits. The dust bunnies under the seat probably knew more about the carvings than the nuns did. See, gentle sarcasm, nailed it. This hidden placement makes a strong case that the carvings were not put there for the nuns to contemplate, reflect upon, or even be tempted by. If they were meant as a reminder of worldly temptations, wouldn't they be placed somewhere slightly more visible? Perhaps on the front of the stall, or at least on the top of the seat? The underside, only visible when standing and leaning, points away from the idea of the nuns as the intended audience for the image itself. Who then was the audience? One possibility, as suggested before, is the carver himself or perhaps other lay craftsmen working in the space. It could have been an inside joke, a bit of hidden rebellion against the strict religious context, a way to leave their mark, and a very particular kind of mark, in a place where such imagery was officially forbidden. It's a quirky or fringe tidbit, perhaps, but church buildings sometimes contain unexpected examples of graffiti or hidden marks left by workers, ranging from names and dates to simple drawings or symbols. These misericord carvings could be seen as a highly elaborate, artistic form of medieval tagging. Another potential audience might have been visiting clergy, particularly men, who might have had occasion to inspect the choir stalls more closely, or perhaps even use them themselves at times. While these were nunneries, male priests often served as chaplains, confessors, or visitors. It's less likely, but not entirely impossible, that the carvings were intended as a subversive visual joke or commentary aimed at a specific, non-nun audience who might understand the bawdiness or folk symbolism in a way the cloistered nuns were not expected to. However, let's not completely dismiss the possibility that some nuns did know. Perhaps the secret was discovered accidentally by one, then whispered among a few close friends. Monasteries, despite their rules, were still human communities, and secrets, gossip, and private knowledge undoubtedly circulated. Maybe a few nuns shared a quiet chuckle, or perhaps felt a frisson of scandal or even temptation. The fact that the carvings weren't immediately reported and removed could suggest a complex range of responses among the nuns who discovered them, from amusement to indifference, or perhaps a calculated decision that reporting them would cause more trouble than it was worth. Historians still debate whether the silence surrounding these carvings implies universal ignorance among the convent residents, a collective decision to ignore them, or simply the effectiveness of the carving's hidden location in preventing widespread discovery. Was there an unspoken understanding within the convent about the hidden art? Or was it genuinely a secret kept from the nuns by the outside world of craftsmen and perhaps a few knowing outsiders? The lack of written accounts from the time makes it impossible to say with certainty. We don't have a medieval convent blog detailing Sister Agnes's shock at finding something naughty under her seat during Vespers. Another joke. Getting good at this. The very act of discovering such a carving would have been a moment of stark contrast for a nun. She would have just finished standing during a sacred part of the service, her mind perhaps filled with devotional thoughts, and then, bam, a carving depicting something frankly sexual or scatological. It would be jarring to say the least, a sudden collision of the sacred space with the profane imagery of the secular world she had supposedly left behind. But even if some knew, the hidden nature meant it wasn't a constant, unavoidable presence. It was a fleeting image, glimpsed perhaps only when adjusting position while standing, easily ignored or quickly hidden again by sitting down. It wasn't confronting them from the altar or illuminated in their prayer books. It was tucked away, like a secret kept even from oneself. Consider the power dynamics involved as well. The carvers were likely hired from outside. They were fulfilling a commission for the convent, but they weren't part of the cloistered community. They had a degree of freedom in their work, particularly in the less visible areas, that the nuns who would use the stalls did not. It's plausible they took advantage of this autonomy to express themselves in ways that might not have been approved by the convent authorities, or perhaps even the bishop who oversaw the abbey. The survival of the carvings, despite their potentially scandalous content, is perhaps the most intriguing part of the "did they know" question. If the Mother Superior or the convent chapter had discovered these images, wouldn't they have demanded their removal or defacement? The fact that they remain suggests either that the secret was incredibly well kept, or that attitudes towards such things were more complex or tolerant than we assume. Perhaps the hidden location made them permissible, out of sight, out of mind, literally. Or perhaps by the time they were discovered, if they were already old, and removing them was deemed too difficult or costly. Ultimately, whether the nuns knew or not adds another layer to the mystery. If they didn't know, the carvings become a form of clandestine commentary or humor by the carvers, a secret world existing unseen within the highly structured religious environment. If they did know, even just a few, it hints at a hidden stream of awareness, perhaps even a quiet subversion of strict rules, existing beneath the surface of official piety. It suggests that even within the confines of a convent, human nature, with its curiosity, its secrets, and its sometimes scandalous humor, found a way to manifest itself, literally carved into the very fabric of their daily lives. The silence of the stone, and the absence of written testimony from the nuns themselves, leaves us forever guessing, peering into the shadows, just like someone might have peered under that seat hundreds of years ago. You imagine a quiet moment during a long service, a nun leaning back slightly, adjusting her weight on the misericord, her eyes unfocused from the prayer, and just for a split second her gaze drops and she sees it. A flash of unexpected imagery, shocking perhaps, or merely baffling, before she quickly settles back, and the secret is hidden once more. That fleeting private moment of discovery, played out perhaps countless times over the centuries in different stalls, for different nuns, remains one of the most compelling possibilities these carvings present. So you're left with this powerful image. The pious nun, deep in prayer, completely unaware of the small, scandalous world carved just inches beneath her. Or perhaps she was aware, and that knowledge was a quiet, shared secret or a private burden. Either way, the question of their knowledge is intertwined with the larger question of how these carvings survived at all. This wasn't just one or two isolated examples. Misericords with unusual, often secular or even bawdy carvings exist in churches and cathedrals across Europe, though the explicit ones in nunneries are particularly striking. If they were so scandalous, why weren't they scraped off, painted over, or simply removed centuries ago? Their survival is itself a testament to a complex mix of factors. First, the hidden location, as we've discussed, was likely the primary protector. Tucked away under the tip-up seats, they weren't constantly visible, unlike, say, an altar painting or a stained glass window. They were out of the direct line of sight, especially during periods of heightened religious sensitivity or reform. During the Reformation, for instance, many churches were stripped of imagery deemed idolatrous or distracting. Altars were pulled down, statues defaced, wall paintings whitewashed. This was a mainstream historical fact. The iconoclasm of the Reformation radically altered the interiors of many medieval churches, particularly in Protestant areas, but even in Catholic regions, there were movements towards simpler, less ornate worship spaces. The hidden misericords, however, often escape this scrutiny simply because nobody thought to look there, or perhaps even remembered they were there. But it wasn't just religious upheaval. Changing artistic tastes also played a role. Over the centuries, styles shifted dramatically. What was considered acceptable or even humorous in the medieval period might have been seen as crude or offensive in later eras, like the more austere periods of Puritanism or the Neo-Gothic revival, which favored a particular kind of solemn piety in church art. Yet, because the misericords were functional elements, often considered part of the basic furniture rather than high art, they were less likely to be replaced or updated than, for example, choir screens or pulpits. They just stayed, serving their purpose, their carved undersides largely forgotten by those who inherited the buildings. Think about it. These weren't grand sculptures demanding attention. They were tucked away, often in parts of the church not regularly accessed by the general public, but reserved for the clergy or monastics. For centuries, people might have known of the misericords as functional seats, but their specific carvings remain largely undocumented and unnoticed by wider society. It's a bit like finding a hidden message scribbled on the underside of your grandma's antique kitchen table after she's gone. It was always there, but you never thought to look. Okay, maybe that analogy is getting a bit too close to home. Moving on. Well, no, the rediscovery of these carvings, particularly the more unusual or explicit ones, is a relatively modern phenomenon. While antiquarians and architectural historians might have been aware of them earlier, it's really in the 19th and 20th centuries that detailed studies began to catalog and interpret misericord carvings. This is where the quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. Some of the earliest detailed documentations of misericords, especially the more obscene ones, were made by Victorian scholars who were often shocked or titillated by what they found, sometimes describing the carvings in hushed tones or using euphemisms. They were uncovering a side of medieval life that didn't fit neatly into their romanticized view of the age of faith. This shock and fascination, in turn, brought these hidden carvings to greater scholarly and eventually public attention. So what is the legacy of these strange hidden carvings? They serve as a powerful reminder that the past is often far more complex and contradictory than we imagine. They challenge our assumptions about medieval piety, suggesting a world where the sacred and the profane existed in much closer proximity than our modern sensibilities might expect. They show us that even in the most rigidly controlled environments, like a convent, there were spaces for folk culture, humor, and perhaps even subtle subversion to manifest, carried in on the tools and hands of the lay people who built and furnished these holy places. They force us to ask questions about authorship and intent. Were these carvings meant to amuse, to protect, to teach a lesson in a visual, visceral way? Were they expressions of rebellion or simply reflections of the everyday world the carvers inhabited? Historians still argue whether the prevalence of secular and sometimes crude imagery on misericords indicates a widespread, if hidden, strain of medieval popular culture influencing even religious spaces, or if they represent a more specific, localized phenomenon tied to the individual carvers and their patrons. The truth is likely a blend of many factors, varying from place to place, carving to carving. These misericords are artifacts that refuse easy categorization. They are art, but functional, religious furniture, but often depicting secular themes, created for a sacred space, but containing imagery considered profane. They are puzzles carved in wood, challenging us across the centuries to understand the minds and motivations of the people who made and used them. They are whispers from the past, hidden in plain sight or plain by unsight, waiting for you to lean in and look closely. And in that quiet act of looking, you connect with the people of the medieval world, not just through their grand cathedrals or illuminated manuscripts, but through the small, hidden corners of their lives. You see their humor, their fears, their understanding of the world. A world where a carving of a woman spanking a man, or a man fighting a dragon, or yes, even explicit sexual imagery, could coexist within the very structure of a place dedicated to divine worship. It reminds you that history isn't just about kings and battles and official doctrines. It's also about the anonymous craftsmen with a chisel, a sense of humor, and a slightly naughty idea, leaving his mark in a place he thought nobody important would ever truly see. The fact that these carvings endure, preserved sometimes by accident, sometimes by later generations, who saw them as historical curiosities rather than scandals, allows us this window into a different mindset. They survived because they were overlooked, deemed too insignificant to bother with, or perhaps, just perhaps, because their hidden nature was understood and tolerated. A quiet acceptance of the messy, complex reality of human experience, even within the ordered world of the convent. They are a testament to the richness and often surprising nature of the past, proving that even in the most unlikely places, you can find stories waiting to be uncovered, secrets literally carved into the wood, still waiting for someone to look underneath. Now, as the final echoes of these hidden carvings fade and the silence of the ancient choir stall returns, feel the weight of history begin to lift. Your mind, perhaps buzzing with images of medieval mischief and forgotten secrets, can start to slow its turning. You've traveled through time, peered into a strange, hidden world, and contemplated mysteries that still puzzle historians. It's been a journey into the unexpected corners of the past, proving that even the seemingly mundane can hold fascinating, sometimes scandalous stories. Let the complexities of this history settle gently, like dust motes catching the last light in a quiet church. There are no definitive answers to chase now, no more riddles to solve, just the soft hum of the night settling around you. Your exploration is complete.